Hello and welcome back to the Metropol Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. So System Gateway contains 8 Jinteki cards, which we'll be talking about today, plus 2 neutrals we're going to append here right on the end. For those who don't know how this works, I'm going to be talking about each card one by one, and I'm aware that there's a population watching this that has just got into Netrunner through System Gateway. Firstly, welcome. And then it's important to know that these cards also exist as part of the standard format, which is the larger, big competitive Netrunner format that encompasses the last 5 years of Netrunner releases. So we're going to be talking about these cards, hopefully clearly for both of those populations. I'm hoping it lands well. If not, do let me know. That's largely it. There are timestamps not only in the description, but on the YouTube time bar. So if there's a certain card you want to jump to, just go ahead and jump in. And real quick, actually, if you like this kind of content, if you want to give this video a like or subscribe to the channel, that actually greatly helps me out and it would be really appreciated. Thanks. Okay, let's start. We have a lot to talk about. So we're going to start with Jinteki cards, and I think it's a good time to maybe take a couple minutes to talk about what Jinteki means to a Netrunner player who has been playing Netrunner since it was rebooted back in 2012. So this is the paragraph that exists on Nisei's Learn to Play Corp page, and I'll just read out what they say about Jinteki. So it says, Jinteki, life is code, and code is mutable. Jinteki's biotech empire demonstrates this in everything from medtech to bioweapons. They are best known for their monopoly on clone production, competing with Hansei by pushing aggressively into labor markets with specialized, gen-engineered clones. Rumor has it that they take desired traits from animal genetics, but Jinteki has refused to reveal their trade secrets. And Jinteki takes their secrets very seriously. Although they seldom deign to dirty their hands with wetwork operations, they have no problem setting up traps for an unsuspecting runner and rezzing dangerous ice. Another criminal fried by their own rig is a tragedy, but not a liability. Runners tell stories about their runs against Jinteki, being thwarted at every turn as if someone could anticipate their every move. It is alleged that Jinteki uses their clone projects to research the potential of human psionic abilities, but serious scientists dismiss these claims. Jinteki remains silent on the matter. I think that's awesome. That's a really good description if you ask me what Jinteki is. And Jinteki is one of the longest or one of the oldest corporations in the Android lore. If I'm not mistaken, the Android board game was the battle between Jinteki and Hansei, as mentioned in here, as they compete for that mass market cheap labor solution. Jinteki going for clones, and as we talked before, Hansei building robots called bioroids. So what does Jinteki do in this game? And a lot of the things they do it's just anything biotech. So when it comes to anything with genetics, genetic resequencing is an agenda, they'll be touching just about all of this. This is a pretty general example, but it's pretty large or wide reaching. When it comes to food, they also got their hands into that, whether it's making new ways of making food in the future, or when it comes to biomedical stuff, biotech, they also have their hands in that. So it's anything basically biotech. And because this game's been out for a while, they've explored largely all parts of that, which is really cool to see. Now, a really big part of biotech, and I imagine this is the majority of their sales, I guess I'm guessing here, is clones. And Jinteki has been hitting that cheap labor market by providing clones, people that they have built scientifically to be suited very specifically for certain jobs. And then they're sold into these markets pretty cheaply. And you see this across cards like Turtlebacks, which are representing clones that work well in low gravity or vacuum environments, or even the Tenma line, which is a series of clones designed just to deliver things because they're quite good at driving. Funny enough, there's actually a couple runner clones, and Ken Tenma is an existing Jinteki clone who at some point has gained I don't know exactly what to say, not exactly sentience, but the sort of freedom and self-drive to do things on their own. Now, as we said, HB does tackle this market. They are trying to push bioroids into this market of cheap labor. So nothing is cheaper than a robot. Buy it once, keep it repaired, while Jinteki is pushing in clones, which, eventually has some other problems attached to it. Now, there is this sub-story, and it doesn't really show up in Gateway, but there's always this political battle where Jinteki and HB are kind of pushing for their opposite clients, or for Jinteki is pushing for the bioroids to be recognized as something closer to people, while Jinteki is trying to make sure that their clones don't receive the freedoms and the sort of equality that people do. And it's something that showed up largely in the Mumbet cycle, which is now 4 or 5 years old, but still shows up into modern cards. Now, an interesting thing that was also touched in the paragraph is the idea of psionics. And this is really fascinating because for a lot of people in the original core sets, this was one of their first experiences of what Jinteki represented. And that was these Nisei clones. So it seems that somehow in the science in Netrunner, Jinteki has figured out how to get precognition to work. If you're familiar with the short story Minority Report or the Tom Cruise film, you kind of understand how this works. There's this very clear here, a vat of clones that can actually see the future. And they use that in a lot of different ways, whether it's predicting markets, who knows, but a lot of the times that comes into pre-crime. The idea that they can stop runs, they can stop crime if they know that the crime is going to happen before it even does happen. And we've seen this across a couple cards, whether it's the Nisei clones, precognition itself is pretty straightforward, or even Akiko Nisei, another ex-clone who now is a runner and can kind of see the future a bit with R&D if everything lines up well. And I think the last and maybe the biggest thing that a lot of people relate Jinteki to is net damage, and specifically net damage traps. Snare has been around forever and it's still within the standard card pool right now. And this is such a big deal. Any axis, no matter where the axis comes from, if the runner is running, a snare can hit you out of nowhere. And that can do 3 damage and that can flatline you in the wrong situation. You have to watch out. Net damage can come from just about anywhere if you're playing against Jinteki. And you see this net damage on across a lot of different cards. There's different kinds of damage within Netrunner, and net damage is a specialty of Jinteki. So whether it's an agenda like Obokata Protocol, a big 5/3 agenda which the runner has to suffer pretty heavily to be able to steal, or some of the scariest ice, DNA Tracker can hit you for 3 net damage and steal 6 credits. This sort of really scary, spiky stuff is pretty core to Jinteki. And as you said, if a criminal gets fried at their rig, it's not a liability, right? Another big thing is this sort of secrecy and hidden information. There's a bunch of different kind of decks in Jinteki where people will play a lot of remote servers, but not ice them up heavily because they're playing a totally different game than what Netrunner might look to you when you first learned it, which involves ice and building up defenses. They just go horizontal and they put cards on the table, they put advancements on the cards, and then they put the question into your hand. Where are the agendas and where are the traps? If you Mushin no Shin a card out, sure, it could be an agenda in server 6 with no ice on it, but there's also a big chance it was a Project June bug that is going to do, 6 net damage to you and maybe flatline you. And this is so near and dear to so many Jinteki players. A lot of times this is called a shell game strategy where you put a lot of things out and try and guess what the right things are. And the runner is under a lot of pressure to dismantle that because if they make the wrong move, it can very quickly be lethal. I think that's a pretty good recap of what Jinteki is. So they care about secrecy. They have a lot of traps. They specifically do net damage. They produce clones. And also they're somehow into pre-crime and precognition, the ability to see the future, which is, I don't know how well explored it is in this set, but it's a very interesting part of what they're up to. They're also like pretty strong competitors against HB, and you don't see a lot of crossovers. There used to be actually a HB deck that specifically says you can't control or you can't include Jinteki cards. So where does that leave us? Let's talk about System Gateway, and this is the Jinteki identity we have. It's called Restoring Humanity. Like every identity within System Gateway, it's a 40 minimum deck size. You have the full 15 influence to work with, and it says when your discard phase ends, if there's a face down card in archives, gain 1 credit. And it says an end to suffering. And this is something that can be said about a lot of the identities across System Gateway, is that at least for me, they remind me of a combination of older identities kind of combined together to make something kind of interesting. So when we're talking about restoring humanity, it reminds me of 2 cards. And firstly is Industrial Genomics, which was an identity that I'm pretty happy isn't in the standard format right now, but it gave you a reason to protect archives, and it gave you a reason to put a lot of cards in archives, and specifically face down cards. The more face down cards in archives, suddenly the trash costs of things that you have installed becomes impossibly high. And this sort of protect archives and get face downs in it does exist still within Restoring Humanity. Another card it reminds me of is Tenon Institute, which also did just rotate and left the standard card pool. But Tenon Institute gave you a reason to run, even if it was just something as simple as running archives. Because if the runner made a successful run, then the corp didn't get the benefit of that free advancement counter. And in the early game, a lot of times you'd see runners just run archives for no reason besides to stop that advancement counter. And Jinteki Restoring Humanity in some way puts that same sort of pressure on you. You want to run archives to get those cards flipped so they don't maybe get credits the next turn. And maybe actually it's kind of a big point here. So restoring humanity gives you money. And just about all the identities in Netrunner that give you money, and this is pretty consistent money. You can trigger this every turn if you're really working at it. That adds up to being a lot of money. And you can't do a lot in Netrunner without having good money. You're really happy to get as many credits as you can. And hopefully you're getting them by doing the same thing your deck wanted to do anyways. I'm going to start by saying that there's a lot of cards within System Gateway that actually will trigger Restoring Humanity's ability pretty consistently and pretty easily, but I'm not going to talk about them now. We're going to talk about them when they come up. It's like 3 or 4 cards that work really well together. So how do you play this? Well, there's something really good about this, that this ability fires at the end of your turn. You don't have to wait to your next turn and make sure there's still face down cards in there. You're going to always get this ability as long as there's one face down card in archives. And you can get face down cards in archives really easily. You can just draw cards. If you're ever on 5 cards in hand, as your last click as a corp, you could always draw to a 6th. And then you have to discard down to your hand size, which is 5, and then there'll be a face down card in archives and you get a credit. So instead of clicking for a credit, you can always consider drawing last click as Restoring Humanity. Now there's a big sidebar here because it's definitely worth noting that drawing last click as a corp is a really dangerous thing to do. Because if you draw an agenda, suddenly you have 2 agendas in hand that you didn't expect, and now it can be a liability not knowing where your agendas are or having them in HQ if HQ is not protected. So do pay that in mind. Now, how does this play against the runner? Well, you can actually make this ability really not difficult to deal with, but just not interesting to deal with at all. As soon as you put a single piece of ice on archives, say it's as simple as a white space within System Gateway, now you're telling the runner, there is a face down card in archives. If you want to deny me, maybe deny me my ability to get a credit for free next turn, which again is a maybe, because if they end up discarding another card on their following turn, you've done really nothing. They have to go through the white space and pay money. And so now the runner has to think, okay, if I want to run archives, I have to pay 2 credits to maybe deny them 1 credit next turn. And I also have to spend a click doing it. And that's a really good thing about Restoring Humanity is a lot of times you can get this value without actually spending a click on it. So as long as you have a single piece on archives, it actually becomes a really bad transaction, like a really bad deal for the runner, where they have to spend time and money just to potentially deny you credits in the upcoming turns. And so just running through a white space to deny the corp money, probably not great. Now there's ways in System Gateway to make that a bit more tenable. If you're, as a runner, you can run archives, also gain a leech token. That's great. Maybe you have a red team firing. That's also really good. Maybe you're getting credits on your penny shaver. There's a lot of good reasons why running archives might not be just for nothing besides flipping up corp cards. But on its own, it doesn't seem great. I don't a lot of times want to run archives just to potentially deny the corp money in the next turns. It's also worth noting that there used to be Crick in the standard format, and this, oh my god, if you had this on archives, running archives just to deny the 1 credit potentially was such a big deal. During Spoilers Week, when we first saw the Jinteki identity Restoring Humanity spoiled, I believe a lot of people thought that it would come with a certain kind of support card that used to be a big part of the Jinteki card pool for a long time, basically since the game came out. And that is the idea of traps that fire from archives. The idea was with cards like Shock that used to be around for a long time, they aren't in standard right now, is that it's the card that you would draw that you were excited to get it into archives because you could easily load up archives with 1 to 3 shocks. And then if the runner ever wanted to check archives just to flip all your cards face up, they would have to suffer 3 net damage. And that's wild. That makes running archives so much worse. Let alone it's a card that in hand, you're actually going out of your way a lot of times to discard to get into your archives. So you don't feel bad discarding an ice or an operation. You're cool discarding a trap that fires from archives. After Shock rotated, eventually we got Breach Dome, which is technically part of the standard card pool, but banned right now. And I think everyone who saw Restoring Humanity thought that Jinteki would receive a card which they wanted to discard in archives that lured the runner to run it, and then once they flipped the card, they would realize it's some sort of trap. And currently in the standard card pool, we don't have a lot that does that. Right? The amount of traps that it can fire in the standard card pool from archives are pretty narrow, and they're actually not particularly, you have to go out of your way to build a cohesive game plan. Space Camp is one of them. This fires from archives. You can get 1 to 3 advancement counters. It's important to know that you have to advance a card that can be advanced. So if you don't have an agenda on the table that really wants advancement counters, you're going to have to go out of your way to play advanceable ice. And that kind of doesn't make entirely too much sense. You also have cards like News Team that could be 2 tags or a negative agenda point. But if the runner fishes one of these out of the archives to take the -1 agenda point, it is no longer in archives. So you can't poison archives for too long. On top of that, you do have cards like Cyberdeck's Virus Suite, and I think modernly, this is probably the best thing you can throw into archives. Right now, this is seeing a lot of play with agendas like Cyberdeck Sandbox. So if the runner has to run archives just to flip cards, and then they hit a Virus Suite, and then they give you 4 credits, they're probably not going to be running archives a lot. And that's probably the best trap you have right now, but it kind of encourages you to run this card pretty heavily. You also have upgrades. It's worth noting you can always put upgrades into on archives. So while you have to spend 2 credits resing the Hokusai grid, again, even just having an unresed upgrade makes archives really scary to run. And things like Disposable HQ are a lot cheaper at 0 to res and has a pretty potent effect if you can ensure that the runner is going to connect with it. So these are the options you have, but we currently don't have anything like Shocked or Breach Dome, which is, I think, a bit of a bummer here. Now, these cards might be coming in the future, and the existence of these cards also like really opened up the design space, or not the design space, but the play space of how you could play Jinteki. A lot of the times, Corps would load multiple traps into archives, and then even use archives as a way to like store agendas for at least a small period of time, where it was very hard for a lot of runners to run archives, to take 3 net damage from shock just to get a 1 in 3 chance of stealing a 5/3 agenda. But none of that really exists right now in Gateway, let alone in Standard. So I'm excited to see if that stuff shows up again. So what else can we do to make our ability fire, or how can we get it to consistently fire? And there's a lot of cards that work well with it. I think in System Gateway, one of the biggest cards that you'd want as a 3 of in any Restoring Humanity deck is Spin Doctor. And this is a very powerful card for a couple reasons. Firstly, it lets you burst draw whenever you really want. So if you're drawing before the end of turn, you can always throw out anything. You have too many cards in hand, you can get those thrown into archives and ensure you're making money. And then one of the best things about this is that you can throw out agendas, and then they'll be in archives. They're not in HQ where you might not want them at the time. And then if the runner runs archives, you can use the Spin Doctor to rescue those agendas. It's a really, really, really big deal that you can use this to filter agendas and get money at the same time. And any burst draw is a really big deal. If you want to just discard cards at the end of your turn because you have too many cards in hand, things like Predictive Planogram might just get you there. You throw out 1 card into archives, you protect archives a bit. That 1 card you threw out might get you 1 to 6 credits throughout the game if the runner isn't running archives. In Standard, I think there's a lot more ways to do that. I was going to talk about Violet level clearance, but this just got banned like 2-3 days ago. So I think the closest we have is Rashida. A lot of times if Rashida fires at the beginning of a turn, you draw 3 cards, you draw your mandatory, and a lot of those turns you end up discarding a card because you have too much, and Restoring Humanity feels good discarding stuff. We also have a lot of cards in the Jinteki card pool that make you discard things. So you can play these and it makes them, I would say, a bit easier to play. There's a special shout out to the ones that were very cheap that cost 0 even to play, because then those become small economy cards. But cards like Genotyping, they technically trash 2 cards off the top of R&D before letting you recur 4. So as long as you leave one of those cards face down into archives, this thing technically costs you 0 to play. And Hasty Relocation is a really fun card that sees no play outside of some old combo decks that don't exist anymore. But now you're playing this and actually gaining a credit, drawing 3 cards and then rearranging the top of R&D from cards with HQ, which you can set up to be ice or traps or basically non-agendas. Now, it's worth noting that if you think you're going to play this every turn to get a credit, it doesn't always line up, because if there's already a face down card in archives, Hasty Relocation won't technically get you a credit. You're going to get the credit no matter what, but it's worth paying in mind, I guess. If you need to turn on your ability, this is a nice way to do it. You've also cards like Kakurenbo that'll flip everything in archives, and then on top of that, get you some advancements for 2, which is good. That's what you expected to pay for it. And you have cards like Sadaka, which lets you trash resources, and it doesn't have it's not a typed ice. So it's hard for runners to interact with this if they don't have an AI or other tricks to break this. You also have cards like Bacterial Programming, a 5/3 that can throw things into archives, get stuff off the top of your deck that you didn't want to draw anyways, and again, ensure you're going to make some money. And outside of faction, we have a couple things. I think Audacity could be interesting. Now, we do have a lot of 3/2s in Jinteki, so you can use this as a fast advance plan and then get some money after that once you've thrown out your whole hand. And also, you have some really mean ice in Jinteki. So if you want to spend 1 influence on a Helheim Cerberus, you can trash your hand. And at the same time, make some really spiky ice really strong, and the runner connects with that, and you're happy either way. I think there also needs to be one last shout out to Subliminal Messaging. This is a really interesting card, and I don't entirely believe in it. But the idea with Subliminal Messaging is if you play multiple copies in your deck and you've drawn them and then they are in your archives, at the beginning of your turn, if the runner hasn't made a run, you get all of the copies back. So you can always play one for a clickless credit and then just discard the other one face down. So it's interesting because it represents a permanent face down new card in archives across the game. But also, if the runner is running archives, you're not going to get these back in the first place. So it feels a bit win more, but your mileage may vary. Now, the big thing I want to compare Restoring Humanity, which is the Jinteki identity that can, I would say somewhat conditionally, but it doesn't necessarily have to be conditionally, give you money, is it's very easily to compare this to Paulina Foods. And Paulina Foods has been in the standard card pool for a really long time, has been pretty consistently competitive for a really long time, on the basis that Jinteki has some good ice, has some good ways to score agendas in remote servers, and the one thing that they do lack is economy. And Paulina Foods gives you a lot of economy. Runners draw pretty consistently every turn, if not every other turn. And Paulina Foods, you don't have to think about it. You don't have to go out of your way. You can just put good stuff in your deck, and throughout a game, you'll probably make 10 to 20 credits. And Restoring Humanity is interesting because in some ways, it kind of looks like the same, but you have to put a bit of effort into it. You have to probably ice up archives, or if the runner doesn't have a good reason to run archives, they could spend a click to deny you that, but they're definitely very comparable. Now, I'll admit I don't have enough testing done with Restoring Humanity, but I feel like in most decks, I'd probably just kind of lean towards Paulina a bit more if I'm playing in standard, just because I know how good this is and I know how consistently it fires. And Restoring Humanity requires you to play a bunch of other niche cards, or encourages you to play these niche cards, which on their own don't seem amazing, while Paulina, you really don't have to do anything besides just play good Netrunner. That being said, this is a 40 card minimum deck, and that is something that has to be valued. Having a smaller deck size, you can play fewer agendas, and your deck is generally much more consistent. And if you're playing a 40 card minimum deck size, that means you can only have 18, or you can have, you're required to have 18 to 19 agendas in your deck. And that means you could actually just run 6 3-point agendas. 6 times 3 is 18. And Jinteki has some really good 3-point agendas you can put in your deck. And then you have a very low agenda density, and you can play some of the strongest agendas. And then you can combine that with other win conditions. Cards like Punitive Counterstrike work pretty well when you have Obokata protocols. And then if you want to score 2 5-3 agendas, you're going to have to find that 7th point. In faction, you have Gene Splicer. So I think there's some interesting reasons why you want to play that sort of 6 3-point agenda suite in a 40 card minimum deck. And I think this is the only one that Jinteki has access to right now. So if you want to try that, that's actually kind of interesting. But that's Restoring Humanity. It's interesting. And if it doesn't sound amazing right now, there are a bunch of cards we're going to be talking about throughout this review that do work really well with Restoring Humanity's ability, but on its own, it'll definitely give you credits, and just getting credits is pretty good. Free money is definitely good, and specifically in Gateway where money might be a bit tight, that money really, really does add up and helps you get to that ice, establish a board, and get closer to scoring 7 points. This is Longevity Serum. It's a 3-2 agenda. It's a research subtype, and it says when you score this agenda, trash any number of cards from HQ. Shuffle up to 3 cards from archives into R&D. Limit 1 per deck. Okay, so it's a 3-2 agenda. Every faction has received in System Gateway a 3-2 agenda with a limit 1 per deck clause on it, and this is Jinteki's. And I'll just start by saying I think this is the worst 3-2 by a pretty considerable margin out of the 4. That being said, 3-2 agendas still will see play pretty consistently because 3-2 is a pretty good ratio. But let's talk about what this one exactly does. So when you score this agenda, you can trash any number of cards from HQ, and then you can rescue those cards by shuffling them into R&D. So first, if you trash a card and leave it into archives, you know your Restoring Humanity is going to fire. That's good. Any card that sets up Restoring Humanity without making you jump to too many hoops, that's fantastic. But another thing that you might find in System Gateway specifically is that you've scored this agenda, and then you have things in hand that you don't want to have in hand because you don't want to ever... You have too many agendas, maybe. You're flooded, let alone scoring orbital superiority in System Gateway feels kind of bad often. So you can trash that card, you can throw it into archives, and then using the second sentence, you can shuffle it back into R&D. That's nice. It lets you carve your hand. If your hand isn't what it looks like, you can throw it out. Now, this doesn't let you draw cards, so you're going to be at a hand deficit after you've done that. You're going to have less cards in hand, but it lets you recover from that. It also lets you shuffle up to 3 cards from archives into R&D, and that's recursion, and that's good. You can shuffle anything with that. It goes back into your deck, and then you'll likely redraw it. There is, you can use this on anything, right? Like maybe you've played a hedge fund, turn 1, that's now back in your deck, and so you're likely to draw a hedge fund. That can be good. Maybe you have something like Managarm Skunkworks that you paid influence for, and this is really nice, but once it's trashed, it's kind of out of the game for a bit, so you can pull it back in, and then it'll be in your deck until you want to draw it. That stuff is good. Now, the weird thing is that out of a lot of the like recursion was kind of a premium effect in a lot of the like welcome to Netrunner and the core sets. There weren't a lot of cards that could do this. Take things from archives, put them back into the deck or into HQ. And the difference right now is in System Gateway is that is like not hard to get into your deck. It's an ability that a lot of people will put 3 copies of Spin Doctor in their System Gateway decks because Spin Doctor is such a strong card, let alone also a very strong card with Restoring Humanity's ability. So this sort of ability like is not really necessary for any deck that plays 3 Spin Doctors because Spin Doctor largely does the same thing. Now, of course, you can use Longevity Serum on top of all this stuff and it's probably fine, but this is the sort of ability which like doesn't jump out at being anything unique as opposed to what other cards in your deck can already do. And that's a bummer. When it comes to things like having agendas in hand that you don't want to deal with, like we also have Sprint in faction, and Sprint is also a very similar effect to Longevity Serum, and it's a 1 influence 0 cost card. Again, this is also a 1 influence 0 cost card. So the Longevity Serum effect for me doesn't seem that impressive when there's so many other cards. You can put 6 other cards in your deck that do the exact same effect. Now, of course, it's a 3/2 agenda that's on its own is unique within System Gateway, so you're definitely going to play this in your Jinteki deck. But its effect is like pretty underwhelming to me. Now in standard format, we have seen other cards to do something like this and all those cards got played. Now preemptive action is not seeing a lot of play in standard right now. And that's because Spin Doctor is a hell of a card, but you kind of get the idea. Now on top of this, one really weird thing here is that 3/2 agendas are very good. The idea is that you put them behind a single piece of ice, you don't have to advance them, and they look like anything. They could be an agenda, they could be an upgrade, they could be an asset. As soon as you start advancing cards, that kind of lowers down the idea of what this could be in the remote server, but that's one of the beauties of 3/2s. They could look like anything, and then next turn you just score them out. Advance, advance, advance. You don't pay anything, you take on no risk besides putting it out there. You don't pay any credits, pre-advance it, and then have a chance of losing it, and you score it. But out of any faction, and mind you, again, all the factions got 3/2 agendas in System Gateway, this is the one that I think is going to see the least amount of play in standard, and that's because Jinteki right now is really good at scoring 4/2 agendas. This deck I think is a bit older at this point. This deck came out last year, but you'll notice this is like pretty similar to what right now agenda suites look like in Jinteki decks. The idea is that you have Cyberdeck Sandbox, a 4/2, and you see Mark II, a 4/2, and then some 5/3s, just so you don't play a lot of agendas. And the big deal right now is one of the best cards in Jinteki is La Costa Grid. And La Costa Grid gives you free advancements on your agendas. So you can actually install a 4/2 agenda in a remote server with the La Costa Grid, get a free advancement, and then advance, advance, advance. So you're basically doing that same never advance play, but with 4/2s as opposed to 3/2s. And technically 4/2s, by being a bit harder to score out, are meant to have a bit better abilities than 3/2 agendas. And I think all the 4/2 agendas in this deck do have stronger abilities than the Longevity Serum. So I think there's a fair few decks that are playing this sort of like glacierish kind of Pollen of Foods where they want, or any Jinteki deck where they want to build a remote with upgrades in it and good ice, will actually not end up playing Longevity Serum and instead opt to play some of the better 4/2 agendas, which they don't struggle to score out, which is a bummer to the Longevity Serum. And I think all the other factions the 3/2 will find a home in competitive decks, and this one probably won't. Now that being said, you might be able to build decks that work with this well. Trickle Light is really interesting. You do have this fast advance tool within Jinteki. If you have a card with some advancements on it, again, maybe with Restoring Humanity, the space camps that fired and put advancements on some ice, you can Trickle Light to score out a Longevity Serum from hand. And then once you score it, you can shuffle those Trickle Lights back into your deck that you've just spent. And that's really nice. That means that that combo will show up later in the game. And you do have 3 Project Yagi-Udas in your deck, so you can actually score 4 3/2s, and maybe that's how you win the game. So I think there's an option there. It'll probably be a very different deck, but I'm pretty sure in a lot of these Jinteki Glacier decks in standard format, you're not going to play Longevity Serum because the 4/2s are really good. Now there is the shout out here that this is Philotic Entanglement, and Philotic Entanglement was the old 3/2 limit 1 per deck Jinteki agenda, and this has rotated and been replaced by Longevity Serum. And in some ways I'm thankful because Philotic Entanglement represented such a strong win condition that was so hard to play against in some ways as a runner, because it's hard to play around a 1-of per deck, right? It's the same thing on the corpse side, is you can't build a strategy that involves Longevity Serum that easily. Not that you want to, because its ability doesn't do too much. But as a 1-of per deck, it's hard to play around, it's hard to play against, because it existing at any point in time on the table is less likely than just about any other agenda. And Philotic Entanglement, if you didn't play around in certain circumstances, could just win the game flat out. There was a lot of lists that would just play Jinteki Personal Evolution to do additional net damage, and then score out of Flautic Entanglement, out of hand sometimes with Biotic Labor, and then suddenly you just take 4 or 5 net damage out of nowhere. And it's really hard to play around that when it's only a 1 of in the deck. So I am very glad that the power level of the 1 of per deck has been reined in a bit, but still, I think the power level of this is just way worse than any of the other 3/2s. All these other 3/2s I'm really excited to play because they do interesting and cool things. Luminal gives you 3 clicks to let you rebuild your board or do some fun combo stuff. Tomorrow's Headline is a legitimate trap, and Above the Law can really blow out some runners in the early to mid game. Longevity Serum just does something that 3 My Spin Doctors already does, which is kind of a bummer. So yeah, that's a bit unfortunate. Now let's talk about Urtica Cipher. This is a Jinteki asset. It has the fun subtype Ambush, which I'm going to just say naively, Jinteki has the most of those out of any faction. It says you can advance this asset. That's always really exciting. And it says when the runner accesses this asset while it's installed, do 2 net damage plus 1 net damage for each hosted advancement counter. It costs nothing to res, not that a lot of times you will res it. It costs 2 influence and 2 to trash. And there's some flavor text. It says a novel spin-off of Chronos Tech was ad mixing sensitive data with ethically sourced brain images of injured staff. Few intruders can handle 1,000 years of skin burns in 1 moment. That is really dire flavor text. And in terms of skin burns, Urtica, mind you, is like the Latin term. It's a genus of flower that you might know as nettles or stinging nettles. And I don't know if you had the privilege to touch one of these. They're called kopriva in like Slovenia and Croatia. And I know as a kid walking through the hills, you touch this thing and it has these little like barbs on them, like kind of like fur. And if you touch it one way, you're generally okay. You touch it the other way, you get a pretty bad burn that's going to follow you for a couple days, and it's rough. So there's a lot of rumors of Jinteki using animal genes and ideas into some of their ice and their science. There's also like a big recurring theme of specifically like spiky plant stuff showing up in Jinteki, whether it's things like sundew, which is a carnivorous plant. The original art on Snare is a Venus flytrap, and now we have the Urtica Cipher. So again, skin burns. Maybe they've researched and pulled that together out of Kopriva. So this is a direct reprint of a card that rotated at the same time, which is a very, very important card to always know exists in Netrunner, which was Project Junebug. Project Junebug has very similar text, except this is just a bit different. It can be advanced, it's an asset, it's an ambush, and it says when the runner accesses this, as long as the corp can pay 1 credit, you do 2 net damage for each advancement token in Project Junebug. So these things have a bit different. There's a bit of difference of how they work. Project Junebug with 2 advancements on it would do 4 damage, and an Urtica Cipher still with 2 advancements on it will do 4 damage. So Project Junebug does do more damage the more advancement it has, but at 2 advancements, it is the same between an Urtica and a Junebug, which is interesting. But this is basically a reprint of Junebug, and there's a lot to talk about why this sort of card is really important, that it exists within the Jinteki card pool. Okay. So firstly, Urtica Cipher has a really generous text on it where if you just install this and don't advance it, it does 2 net damage, which is wild. I don't think there's any trap in the game that will do that simply for no additional cost. And that's actually pretty relevant. I haven't been doing that enough within System Gateway just because the idea of doing 4 net damage, if I can get the runner to hit this with advancements, feels so much nicer. But you can just install this in a remote server. Don't res it. The runner might run it thinking it's something like a Nico campaign in Gateway, and instead they take 2 net damage. Sick. That's not bad. That being said, most of the time I end up putting us in a remote server behind 1 or 2 ice and advancing it, and it looks like an agenda. And this is a really big deal. Having cards in Netrunner that look like agendas but aren't agendas is like core to this game. If you go back all the way to the original core sets, every faction, I think barring one, always had cards like this. HB used to have aggressive secretary. It looked like an agenda. It was an agenda. And now if you hit this, your programs get trashed. And right now in System Gateway, we have 2 cards like that, if I'm not mistaken. We have the Urtica Cipher, which again, looks like an agenda. The runner runs it. It isn't an agenda. Whoops, 4 net damage. And also you do have Clearinghouse, which works a bit differently, but it's important to know. Cards like this are super important to have in the game. Because of the game, there's a point in time where the runner could have way more money than you. They have all their breakers. They have way more money. And at that point, what can you do? You have no real threat as a corp if you've built your deck in a certain way. And having cards like this where you can install advance, and the runner could think, okay, I can get into that remote server. It's not going to be very expensive. I have a lot of money. And then they end up taking 4 net damage, which has a chance of being lethal. And then you win the game. That's really important to a game where economy might be skewed in one side. And that's awesome. I find a lot of times, I've actually died to this a lot playing System Gateway. And a lot of the times it is because I kind of overextend. There's a lot of cards that are run events that you want to spend on running a remote. Cards like Overclock or Tread Lightly that you run through a remote, and then you hit something like a Tithe and you're like, oh, I don't care, let that fire. And then you access with 3 cards in your hand and you die. So for that reason, Urtica Cipher is always going to be very interesting. And there's a lot of times where I'm playing against my partner and very boldly install advances, and I can't tell, oh, she knows I can get in there. Is that an Urtica or is that the agenda? And that's why we're playing Jinteki a lot of the times. Let's talk about the fork here. So I install advance and Urtica Cipher into a remote server, iced or uniced, up to you. Now at this point, the runner's deciding, okay, there's a chance that's a send a message or there's a chance that's an Urtica Cipher. Now this is where things get interesting. If they don't run the Urtica Cipher, it looks like nothing good is going to happen and you've spent a bit of time and money on something that didn't really matter. And this is where the other cards within System Gateway start interacting in a really fun way. I'd argue the next thing that you want to do when they don't run the Urtica Cipher is to go advance, and advance is up to 4. And at that point, the runner's now maybe a bit confused because if that was to send a message, you could have scored it. But there's actually a reason why you want to take cards like send a message and advance them up to 4 counters. And that's because if there's a send a message on the table with 4 advances on it, next turn you can advance to send a message and then maybe play 2 copies of Neurospike and the runner could die. So even if your trap fails in the first place, within System Gateway and even in Standard, there's a lot of good reasons why you still want to commit to it. And there's this beauty of how all these cards interact well together. And once the Urtica Cipher has 4 advancements on it, it does 6 damage, which is a lot of damage. So even if the trap doesn't work, the trap just being on the table matters a heck of a lot. And to some extent too, if it has more advancements on it, it might look like a clearinghouse. So if they didn't run on 4, you could do advance, get up to 6 advancements. And now the runner understands, okay, if that's an Urtica Cipher, that's what, 8 damage? But if that's a clearinghouse and I don't run it, I die. And sometimes you win that 50-50, the Yomi, the idea of getting into the runner's head and seeing which way they'll go. Whether you want to call that precog or psionics, that's up to you, but that's a very central idea. And the fact that these 3 or 4 cards exist within System Gateway allows you to play these mind games in a really cool Jinteki way. Is it an Urtica? Is it an agenda? Do I have to worry about Neurospike? Is it a clearinghouse? Now, outside of System Gateway, this sort of mind game, this sort of space has been around in Netrunner for such a long time. Project Junebug is classically what we did, but we used to have cards like Mushin no Shin that just said, hey, here's a card from my hand. It has 3 advancements on it. Last click, I'll advance it. And now immediately you're playing this sort of game of, oh my God, is that a Junebug? Or right now, oh my God, is that a Urtica Cipher? Or is it a viral weaponization? Which if I don't run it, it's going to be a problem. And the stakes get even higher when it could be maybe an Urtica Cipher you can always draw up to have enough cards. You say, okay, that could be an Urtica Cipher that's 6 net damage. I'll draw once, run. And you'll probably be fine, but things get a bit different when it's a Cerebral Overrider that threatens to do 4 brain damage. And after you have 4 brain damage, it's really hard to play against Jinteki that can do net damage. Brain damage, mind you, reduces your hand size. This is worth saying because this isn't in the System Gateway rules. Brain damage is random damage from hand, but for every brain damage you take, it permanently decreases your hand size. So it's pretty scary. This is a really fun deck. This is Josh Quinlan's deck that came in top 8 at Worlds of 2018. And this deck list, the idea was, you see here against Abram, who is one of the top players, Josh is just Mushin no Shinning, just putting things on the table with 3 and 4 advancements on them, no ice, and leaving them. And for a player like Abram, who really, really cares about efficiency and deck building and this sort of like economics of Netrunner that are very, very relevant and well studied, these sort of decks and this sort of play throws all of that stuff out of the window. The question is it a Cerebral Overrider? Is it an agenda? And this deck had some more tricks into it to make that even more spicy, but that's kind of the idea. Also in Standard, you have Ronin, which is another good reason where if they don't run your Urtica Cipher, you can continue to advance it. Because if this has 4 advancement counters on it, you can just spend a click to do 3 net damage. If there's 2 Ronins on the table, they're dead, usually. So it's a really fun play space to play within. Now, outside of Jinteki, there's actually, I think, one other identity that really cares about the existence of Junebug or the new Junebug Urtica Cipher. That's specifically Jemison Astronautics, which might sound wild, but if you haven't seen this before, the idea with Jemison is whenever they forfeit an agenda, you get to put a bunch of counters on a card. So the idea is that if you have an Oberth, something like an Oberth protocol in a remote server, and the runner's running it, and you say at the last moment, do you want to access? And they commit to the access. After that, you still have a paid ability window. So then you end up resing your Oberth protocol. You forfeit a 3-point agenda, and you put 4 counters on the unknowing Urtica Cipher that they've just agreed to access, and suddenly they die out of nowhere. So if you haven't played against these are really fun back in the day with Junebug. They got a bit weaker with Urtica because Urtica doesn't do as much damage on higher advancement counts, but it's still a pretty strong strat. And one of the other big differences between Urtica Cipher and Project Junebug, and this is actually quite generous, is that Junebug had a 0 trash cost. That largely didn't matter too much if you run a remote and trash it. It was a fair bit, it was a bigger problem when you ran central servers. Cards like this only do something when they're installed, let alone when they have advancement counters on it. So one of the best things you do against trapped Jinteki decks is just hammer central servers. If you can find this on top of the R&D, you trash it for free, you can run back and see a new card, and you obviously don't have to worry about the Junebug. But the fact that the Urtica Cipher actually has a trash cost of 2 means that it actually costs something to trash, and it puts a bit of an economic tax, and it might mean that it hangs out on R&D in some certain situations. Another really good point is that if someone advances the Urtica Cipher and you've run it, and you've taken the 4 net damage, you can now decide to trash it or not. And with 2 trash costs, you might not decide to trash it. And at that point, this Urtica Cipher is a surviving target for Trick of Light, which is kind of quite nice. So now you have a battery, so you can install your longevity serum, advance, and then Trick of Light to take 2 counters off of it and score from hand. So that actually kind of works nice. The fact that this isn't a trash on site anymore might mean it survives for some Trick of Light plays. Now, lastly, the value of these sort of plays did get a fair bit worse. Like that sort of deck that I showed you with Josh Quinlan playing on top tables, it really depended on Mushin Notion, because this card was the quickest way to get the most advancements on a single card. The idea that you could do Mushin advance, and then suddenly your trap had 4 advancements on it. And 4 advancement counters is when it begins to get incredibly scary and incredibly high stakes. And we just don't have that anymore. This just rotated, and the replacement for it right now is Kakurenbo, and Kakurenbo will largely only put 2 advancement counters on it. And in some ways, that makes it a lot easier to start checking the Urtica Ciphers, because you only take 4 net damage as opposed to the 8 that you used to take with a Mushin Advanced Junebug, but it also really lowers the threat of these things. It's also worth saying for a lot of people who have maybe just gone into Netrunner recently and are playing mostly online, the difference between playing one of these decks in person, where people have physical reads and you're sitting there sweating with you have 2 agendas on the table, both advanced, and they look like traps, it's a totally different game. So you got to play stuff in person. It's for the most fun. Finally, the one good counter to this, well, there's a couple good counters to this, but in the original core set that had things like Project Junebug and Aggressive Secretary, there's also this neutral card called Infiltration that let you expose stuff. So it made those sort of traps also a lot less fun to play. Because if I install advance my Junebug behind 2 pieces of ice, a lot of times the runner would just say Infiltration, what is it? Oh, it's a Junebug, I'm not running it. And you don't have anything like that in System Gateway. So a lot of times your traps are a lot more scarier, and I think they'll connect a bit more, which is fun. Within Standard, Infiltration doesn't exist anymore. The closest you have is Falsified Credentials, which does show up out of faction, but a lot of times if you're playing these sort of decks against criminals, it's actually pretty difficult. So Falsified Credentials will just peek at the card and be like, oh, you advanced it 4 times as an Urtica. Cool. And then not deal with it. There's also always tech. There is tech within Standard. If you're worried about net damage decks, you can play cards like No One Home. And then if you hit that net damage, as long as you have some money to pay into the trace, you're usually pretty safe. But that's Urtica Cipher. It's a pretty cool reprint of Junebug. The trash cost is nice. The fact that the damage scaling isn't as severe means that these sort of like net damage decks aren't as like wildly swingy, where it's like, oh, 8 net damage. Oh, you ran the wrong thing, you lose. And now it's usually like, oh, you take 6 net damage. You could draw and survive that. But it's good. And it's really important a card like this exists. And I'm really happy within Gateway. All the things are in that to have that sort of fun, like fork between, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? I die on 2 of them. I need to call this correctly. Let's talk about our first ice. This is Diviner. It is a code gate ice. It's also the subtype AP, which I think stands for anti-personnel. You see that on ice that generally hurts you. It's 2 to res, 3 strength, and it has a single subroutine that says do 1 net damage. If you trash a card with a printed play or install cost that is an odd number, end the run, and it clarifies that 0 is not odd. Is that a surprise to anyone? I always thought 0 was even. I don't know. It says it reads your future in a single biometric sweep and has this lovely art from Balance Sheet, who's been doing actually a lot of art for Netrunner, and I think I've also seen their art within Keyforge. Now, this is a really cool, flavorful card. Diviner and the Divination and this art is a big reference to the I Ching. Oh, hold on, to the I Ching. Here we go. And the I Ching is like this really, really old, enduring text coming from as old as 1000 to 750 BC from China. I Ching translates in English roughly to the Book of Changes or the Classic of Changes. And it's kind of hard to describe this. It's been used across so many fields. But in short, this was a book, a divination text that was explaining certain ways to use numbers and some other ways to predict the changes and predict the future. Largely. Classically, this was done by throwing sticks, if I'm not mistaken. You throw yarrow sticks, and the way that they landed, you would use that to predict how the future is gonna look. I think more modernly, coins are used. You flip like 3 coins a couple times, and you come up with some answer, and then you use those numbers to look at charts and look at figures, and then figure out how the world's gonna go. And this is just used across so many different fields, whether it's used as a religious text, a cosmological text, a philosophical text. It's like a very just like broadly applied idea. Again, anything that studies changes and trying to like get to that sort of like natural philosophy of what the world's gonna look like based off of rules. It can be extrapolated pretty freely. Now, this sort of art is actually a hexagram. It's really cool. These are the standard hexagrams you see in I Ching. I Ching is basically a list of these. I forget how many hexagrams there are. There's a fair few, 64 of them, that are these combinations of between yin and yang, the full line and the broken line. And basically how these sticks were thrown or how the coins would flip would reveal and read as one of these, and then this would give you some sight into the future. And this, if I'm not mistaken, assuming that this red part at the bottom is the bottom, this is actually the 12th hexagram, which is called pi or p, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is the hexagram that defines obstruction, which is really fun when it comes to that being on a piece of ice. Also, interestingly, where there should be gaps in the hexagrams, there's these like DNA structures, which is like very inherently Jinteki. All right, so it's a code gate, and it does 2 things. It does net damage, which is nice. It trashes a card from the runner's hand, but then it sometimes ends the run. Wow. And it's really fun when it comes to like predicting the future, seeing how often this will happen, the coin flipping, not being sure how this is going to work out is like really exciting, a really exciting part of this card. Now, the question is, how often does this land? And if you're playing within System Gateway, the numbers are kind of astounding. Failspike posted, this is the System Gateway starter 30 card deck that if you bought System Gateway printed, it'll be like the top runner deck that they want you to play with to learn the game. And if you look at this, it's 80% odd cards. 80%. There is literally like 6 cards in the 30 card deck that are odd, even, and the rest are odd. So if you're playing a System Gateway starter deck, Divination should end the run roughly 80% of the time, which is wild if you assume that the number would be about 50-50. I don't know whether that was done on purpose with the design of these cards, but that's hilarious. That's really strong. Now, if you go to the System Gateway, the next deck where you add a couple more cards within System Gateway and you're at the 40 card minimum decks, still playing the neutral catalyst identity, that number goes down to only 65%. That's still pretty good. 65% of the time, it works all the time, and it ends the run, which is really fun. Now, it's worth noting that those kind of assumptions of how often it'll fire are pretty naive, because you can look at the cards and say like, oh, it's more likely that they'll install this instead of being in hand. Sure, Gamble doesn't stay in hand for that long. So it's not exactly that, but those are ballpark numbers and they're pretty good. It also lines up really well with things like Creative Commission and specifically also like VR-cation, which are odd cost cards that generally hang in the hand until the end of the turn. So Divination has a really good chance to hit those, and you feel really good when you do. This is also a really interesting thing about code gates. There's only 3 code gates in System Gateway. And it's kind of hard for a lot of the times it's hard to define what the difference is specifically between barriers and code gates. I think barriers are pretty well defined as something that ends the run. And sentries are classically also really well defined as something that will hurt the runner, trash programs, do damage, stuff like that. And code gates were kind of this gray zone in the middle. A lot of them do end the run, a lot of them do weird stuff, and then a lot of them also hurt the runner with net damage, not often trashing programs, usually some sort of damage. And if you look at the design of the code gates in System Gateway, I don't know whether this was intentionally designed, but all the code gates in System Gateway have the possibility of ending the run, but don't always end the run. which I think is a really cool design space for code gates. These interesting things that, sometimes are a gate, but sometimes the gate is open. And I wonder if that's going to be a change going forward in the design of code gates. I'm a big fan of that, but it's wild because these don't always end the run, and relying on the diviner to end the run it's pretty difficult. It really is pretty difficult. Maybe 80% is good, 65% is good. But then once you get to the pre-constructed decks, I reckon that gets closer to 50. Or not pre-constructed, once you start building your own decks and start playing like a Lu deck or whatever. Okay, let's talk about parts of this though. How good is net damage? Net damage on its own is pretty good. There's not a lot of recursion within system gateways, so if you lose a key card, it's gone. Now, not a lot of the cards are one of, so if you lose your cleaver from hand, you still have a second cleaver in your deck, but you have to draw it. And that's a big thing, is that net damage could be like, oh, I hit a good card from your hand. But one of the bigger things is now you have less options in hand, and now you have to spend more time drawing. And specifically, card draw in System Gateway is pretty thin. So you're going to have to spend a lot of clicks drawing up cards. So just having the net damage as a way to slow down the runner and limit their options on its own is pretty good. Now, having the net damage being an actual threat to the runner, that is a bit different than some of the original core sets of Netrunner. Because if I hit a diviner, and I take the net damage and I go on to access R&D or HQ, there's no real threat in there anymore. The only threat you have to worry about if you take net damage and access cards is if you're accessing an advanced or technically an unadvanced Urtica Cipher. But if this thing is on central servers, you're generally good to go. And that's like, you can just hit this, and you're never scared of accessing with few cards in hand, which is very different than some of the original core sets. That's what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way. Now, we haven't talked about this much with some of our other reviews, but it's really important when you look at a piece of ice to understand where you're going to put that, because not all ice are made equal. There's generally two ideas when it comes to ice, that some ice is considered taxing ice and some ice is considered binary ice. And there's some that are in between. But the idea is that binary ice is ice that always unconditionally ends the run. And generally that ice will go on a remote server because you want to score agendas behind that, because you want to make sure that the runner encounters that ice and it ends the run and you're good to go. Now, of course, not all ice ends the run forever once the runner has breakers and money, but in the early game, end the run ice on a remote server is a really good way to score out some agendas. Now, cards like this that don't don't always end the run are a bit scary to use them as that, I'm going to score an agenda behind this. Again, because it doesn't always end the run and you're taking on a huge risk there. But cards like this that are annoying to deal with and do damage or do any of these other non-end the run effects, a lot of the times people consider that taxing ice. And that's the sort of ice that will go on a central server. Because the idea is through Netrunner, some runners will run R&D or HQ maybe 12 to 13 times throughout a game, but run the remote only 4 to 5 times the game. So having an effect like this that is annoying to deal with multiple times and that doesn't specifically need to end the run, that generally lines up a bit better for you. So this is something that I'd more likely put on a central server, and sometimes it does end the run, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a bit sketchy to put this on a remote server and then hoping that at the early game before they have a breaker, this connects and also hits an odd card. So yeah, it really restricts when it's playable, like at what point in the game it really has teeth, and then where it's playable. So let's talk about breaking this again. That's something we also have to look at, and it's not amazing. So 2 for 3 strength, 2 cost, 3 strength, 1 subroutine. If you want to get that through that with Unity in the mid game, you're generally going to pay 2 credits to get through that. Now, a huge issue with code gates, and I think there's no reason if you're playing System Gateway not to play Buzzsaw, is that once you res a diviner, the runner gets through it for 1 credit. And that's terrible. And that kind of really tells you about when this is good. This is good in the early game where face checking it, doing the net damage might be a thing. But as soon as the runner gets a Buzzsaw down, I don't know if I ever want to install this or res this. It feels really rough. And that's kind of weird because we're going to be talking about this later in the video, but Tithe is the other net damage, or one of the other net damage cards, or ice, in System Gateway. And a lot of times I'd rather have a Tithe, on a central server than a diviner, just because I think the Tithe is annoying. It's harder to break. It's usually more expensive to break within System Gateway. And I'd rather not rely on that end the run and just get a credit a lot of the times, because again, we did say this fires 80 to 65% of the time, but it doesn't fire all the time. The runner can always make sure they only have even cards in their hand, sort of. Now, outside of Gateway, is this going to see a lot of play? And I'm going to say straight up, no, it's not. And we do always have to talk about this anytime that we talk about ice, is that right now in Netrunner, the ice is way better than it probably should be. And the Nisei designers have said they're going to try and bring the power level back, but some of the new ice that just gets printed, like Diviner, is going to look really silly compared to things like Engram Flush. This costs the same. It reveals the runner's grip. And then you can trash 2 cards of your choice as long as you nail the name. Even if you don't nail the name, you see the runner's grip and it's 5 strength. Like, this is just so much better than Diviner. Sure, it has no chance of ending the run, but the chance of this ending the run is also like, you can't rely on it too easily. Maybe I'm just not brave enough. You also have cards in faction, things like Aiki, which, are very similar. It's cheaper. Sometimes it allows you to draw cards, which can be a problem, or allows the runner to draw cards, but 2 net damage, that's good. And we even classically had things like Yagura, which I think I would like a bit more. If you put this on R&D, that's nice because it even in some way protects R&D. If that first subroutine fires, you find an agenda, it's on the bottom of the deck. That means not only are they not going to access that agenda this run, but it's largely out of the game until you shuffle. So this doesn't look amazing to me. Break costs, on its own, you res this for 2 in standard. Someone breaks it for 3 with Black Orchestra. That's not terrible. And then Angolo classically does struggle against any of these like mid-range code gates that are above 2 strength because you're going to end up paying 3 credits for this, which also isn't awful. But on its own, it's just really hard to find slots for this in a deck where the format has things like Engram Flush. But Engram Flush is kind of nutty. It seems to be a bit way too good. Also, it has a single subroutine, so in a pinch, in Gateway and outside of Gateway, if you really don't want to deal with it, and I don't think you need to do this because Buzzsaw is just so good, you can botulus it. In a single subroutine, you're going to go pretty far. All right, next we have Karuna, which is the other Jinteki Ice. It's a Sentry, it's still AP, so it's going to try and hurt you. It costs 4 to res, it's 3 strength, and it has 2 subroutines. The first says, do 2 net damage, the runner may jack out. And then secondly, just a clean, do 2 net damage. And it says in flavor text, you did not escape, you were just shown mercy. Another great art by Balance Sheet. And Karuna, in terms of theme, is awesome. It's generally translated from Sanskrit and Pali as compassion or self-compassion, which is part of the spiritual path of both Buddhism and Jainism and is considered one of the 4 immeasurables. The idea that this means compassion and you have a piece of ice in which you can show yourself mercy, and in some ways the corp shows you mercy by letting you to jack out is really fun. You also see these hand symbols kind of on the card itself, and these are mudra, which are they're symbolic ritual gestures or poses that also show up in Buddhism. A lot of times these show up in yoga as well, but with the hands and fingers, you make these signs. There's also a chance that this in the middle is a kila, which is potentially a dagger that also does show up in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, which is a kind of like a 3-sided ritual dagger. Now, this is neat. It's a 4 cost, 3 strength Sentry that does damage. And again, like many of the other cards, this seems like a nice reprint of a card that's been printed since the original core sets, Neural Katana. Same idea, 4 cost, 3 strength, but a single subroutine that says do 3 net damage. And Karuna is really interesting because Karuna makes it so that this ice can do more net damage than Neural Katana, but also makes it way less likely for that to be a horrible face check that flatlines you. The idea that it'll always only do 2 net damage unless you consent for it to do the second 2 net damage, which is fantastic. And again, we've seen way meaner ice, and this card did just rotate, but there were cards like this that existed that could do up to 4 to 5 net damage on click 1 if you just ran, or click 2 if you installed a console and ran, heaven forbid. And the idea that the ice in the game is getting a bit safer and a bit scarier, and it doesn't blow out runners as much, I think is probably a really good thing. So Karuna can be scarier than Neural Katana, but the face check on it is not going to be anywhere near as bad. If you have to get through it though, and you think it's really important, you are going to be taking more net damage. That's cool. So Karuna is another ice. It's never going to end the run. Well, it is if the runner jacks out, right? But it does 4 net damage. And the interesting thing, again, within System Gateway is that the net damage itself isn't a big threat. Because the only time that this can be scary is if the runner is running through this on a remote server, they let this fire and continue and then end up hitting some amount of Urtica Cipher, with advancements or not. Otherwise, if this is on a central server, you can largely face tank through this if you really want to get that good access on HQ or good access on R&D, and you're not scared of anything, barring some wild, like, we'll get to it in soon, but a Neurospike play, or it makes a clearinghouse play really easy. But if there's nothing on the table advanced, you can tank through this if you want. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's just very different than in a format where Neural Katana existed, and you could go through this, take 3 net damage, have 2 cards in hand, access a central server, and hit a snare and die. It's a big difference. In System Gateway, if you're accessing a central server with low cards in hand, there's nothing you need to be scared of. And back in the old core sets, you did have to worry about snare. So this does limit how viable this is as something to protect central servers, because the runner can always tank through it. And there's also some interesting thing when it comes to self-compassion. I like this, that you can see what damage is going to happen. A lot of the times I might have like one card in hand that I really want to keep. So the idea is that if I run into the Karuna, it fires on the face check, I lose 2 cards. And if I lose the good card from my hand that I really don't want to lose, I might actually just continue to go through it, right? Like there's 2 situations. Say this is the one card you wanted to keep in your hand. You hit the Karuna and they miss it with the first subroutine. You're more likely to be like, okay, I'm going to jack out. But if they hit it already, at that point you think, okay, I've already lost my good thing. Maybe this is like, what is it called? At this point, maybe we're doing a sunk cost fallacy, but I'm more likely to continue to go through it. So it's interesting because it gives you that control as the runner, which is not a good thing as a corp. You never want to give the runner that sort of control. But sometimes you'll just face tank through this because you've already lost the good thing. That's okay. And again, you can put it just about anywhere. It's not amazing on a remote server because the net damage doesn't matter. It's probably better on a central server, albeit without snare. Still, if the runner wants to fix their hand, if they lose 4 cards to this, it's going to take them a while to draw 4 cards. It's going to take most of a turn, considering the card draw within System Gateway is really weak. Now, how expensive is this to break? Well, it's actually kind of expensive. With 3 strength, 2 subroutines, if you want to use Carmen, you're going to pay 4 credits, which is really good for a 4 credit ice. Now, this gets a lot better if you play Leech, then you end up only paying 2 credits. And I would recommend you to play Leech if you are playing Carmen. And on the Shaper side, if you have Echelon, well, you're getting through this for generally about 3 credits, right? If you have Leech, give or take. So it's honestly kind of difficult to break. It's not the cheapest to break, but it doesn't have that much relevance, I think, on a remote server a lot of the times. Unless, again, you're jamming Urtica Ciphers every once in a while. Now, do I think this is going to see play in standard format? I'm really not that excited to play this because I think there's a fair few cards that are comparable to this, but that are maybe a bit more interesting and stronger than this. We have Saisantan, which is a very similar AP ice. It costs 1 more to res, 1 fewer strength, but these subroutines are wild. They can do 3 net damage without letting the runner jack out. And if you do hit the right name type that you've named, you actually can double the net damage, or at least do 4 net damage on average. And these are very comparable cards. This costs 1 more to res, it's about the same to break for most situations, and this can just do more net damage and prevents the runner from jacking out and protecting some of the good cards in their hand. This is wild. When it comes to breaking stuff, MK Ultra gets through Karuna for only 3 credits. Saisantan is actually even more expensive, but Galter, it's about the same for both of them. So there's some, I don't feel a lot of reasons why I would want to play Karuna and give the runner the ability to jack out when we have equally mean ice with less conditions attached to it. It's weird because I say that, but this has a big condition attached to it. But at least this one's even more fun to play, I think. So that's where I stand here. Also, like, we still have the problem where Engram Flush is really good, but you do want to play generally like sentries, code gates, and barriers. So at least this is a good sentry you can play in your deck. Now in standard, it is worth knowing way more than within System Gateway is having something like this that only does net damage is actually can be a pretty relevant defense for agendas in remote servers. The idea is that if someone goes through a Saisantan or goes all the way through the Karuna and then accesses your remote server, if there's something like an Obokata protocol in there, they can't steal it. And that's legitimately good protection. You don't need to end the run if you can do net damage. And you can use other cards. Maybe you have Ben Musashi, which can protect any agenda, let alone Obokata protocol. And maybe your deck on top of that has things like punitive counterstrike. So if they do end up stealing the agenda, you're in a good spot to send the Wayland squad after them. So in a bigger format, having these sort of net damage ice is actually much more relevant for remote servers than within Gateway. And within Gateway, this thing is just taxing, but outside of Saisantan or some wild Neurospike plays, we'll get to this in a second, it's not that compelling. Yeah, that's a bummer. Those are the 2 ice. I don't think they're going to see any play outside of System Gateway. Within System Gateway, I think they're pretty fun. But again, outside of that, I think there's so many things that do what they do, but a bit better. All right, let's talk about an economy operation. This is Hansei review. It's a transaction operation. It says gain 10 credits. If there are any cards in HQ, trash 1 of them. Constant self-reflection is the key to excellence. We remember failed ideas, but do not carry them forward. Director Kase, I think it's pronounced, Unknown Leadership Seminar, 1 influence. This is a wild card. So firstly, just in terms of the flavor, Hansei is a central idea in Japanese culture, meaning to acknowledge one's own mistakes and pledge to improvement, which is really cool because if you end up building a terrible Netrunner deck and then you build this one card that you immediately regret putting in there, you can kind of follow that Hansei and you can discard it and get 5 credits and strive for a better tomorrow, which I think is fantastic. That's great. It's really good flavor. And on its own, 5 credits for a card is good. And right now, it's also really relevant and really good. I'm going to start talking a bit outside of Gateway at the top, but a really big deal right now is that IPO was a very central card in almost every faction in Netrunner. This was a neutral card that allowed you to get 5 credits, albeit of course with some conditions attached to it, but this showed up as a 2 or 3 of in just about every Netrunner deck for a long time now, and IPO has rotated out. So there's a big hole right now in Netrunner of a card that can give you that sort of burst econ, about 5 credits that every deck wants and every deck needs. Hansei review right now could be considered. Let's talk about it. It's only one influence, but is this the IPO we all need? Perhaps. So we have to throw out a card, pay this, gain 5 credits. So now it's gaining 5 credits, but not only for a single card, technically for 2 cards, which is actually a very legitimate cost. Drawing cards cost you clicks. So is 2 cards worth 5 credits? Yeah, probably. 5 credits is a lot. Let's start with Restoring Humanity. Again, this is one of the other cards in the set that works really well with it. If there are no face down cards in archives, you can Hansei review out anything, and Hansei review now becomes 2 cards for 6 credits. And that's really, really good. Now you're going to need cards to discard. Again, you want to have extra cards in hand, and that's one of the problems with this. If you don't have a lot of cards in hand, and then you're forced, say you have 5 cards in hand. You install one of them for ice, then you Hansei review, so you throw out 2 other cards. Now you only have 2 cards in hand. And if one of those is an agenda, you're in a kind of a bad spot when it comes to HQ pressure. So what I'm saying is that one of the best things you can combine with Hansei review is card draw. Because one of the easiest times to play Hansei review is if you were going to throw out a card at the end of your turn anyways. Because at that point, it's not that real of a cost attached to it. If you're going to discard down to from 6 to 5 at the end of your turn, why not throw one of those cards out and gain 5 credits? And so within System Gateway, there's a lot of ways to draw. You have Predictive Planogram, draw 3, fantastic. You have Spin Doctor, fantastic. And not only fantastic because you can draw extra cards, but you could even throw out an agenda, get it out of your hand, get your 5 credits of Hansei review, and then shuffle it back into your deck safely with the Doctor. That's really, really good. So with all that sort of support, Hansei review is actually pretty easy to play. And it also has a really easy number to play on, 5 credits. That means you can play this as soon as turn 1. Now again, playing this as soon as turn 1 might be a liability because then you have fewer cards in hand, and then you're likely have to ice up HQ and R&D. At that early in the game, losing a card might be a real thing because it cuts down your possibilities, but yeah, it's definitely 5 credits makes this a lot easier to play than something like IPO, or very importantly, Government Subsidy, which is a very similar card but costs 10 to play. That's the thing about Hansei review. I think you'll be much more excited to play this in the mid to late game where you're drawing ice that you're not intending to install because you already have enough ice, and then additional ice installs get really expensive. So at that point, you might be happier to throw out your extra copy of an upgrade or your extra ice that you don't intend to do anything with. Did we talk about Rashida in Standard? Rashida's really good. You draw 3. Cool. You probably have too many cards after mandatory draw. You're likely to draw into Hansei and something else you can throw out. That's really, really good. And again, watch out for HQ pressure when you're doing this in System Gateway. You have cards like Dockland's Pass. That could be a problem. Cool. Again, a lot of cards to support this. You can throw out anything. You can bring it back with genotyping. That's fantastic. In Jinteki, there's actually a lot of ways to help you draw more cards. This card doesn't see a lot of play. Turns out making the runner draw cards is not very good. But if you have more card draw in hand, the Hansei review is even easier and easier to play. We also have to just say this, building a better world. We'll do this. It says transaction on it. You can gain 6 credits. Anytime a card says transaction on it, you just have to mention building a better world or somebody will be upset with you. Okay, outside of Restoring Humanity, where it's very clearly playable, it gains you up to 6 credits. Is this playable? Yeah, it is. Precision Design, you have extra hand size, so you're more than likely to have something in hand you don't mind parting with. That's pretty cool. And NBN Reality Plus in System Gateway as well. Sometimes you draw 2 cards after they take a tag, and now you have too many things in hand. You're playing your planograms for sure. Why not get some credits? And that's fantastic. Outside of that, in Standard card pool, I don't know if there's many identities that are just swimming in card draw. I think the only card draw ability I can really think of is the new or the returning Near Earth Hub. And that doesn't often like to play. Maybe you can throw out some unique assets that you've drawn your 2nd or 3rd copy of, but that deck doesn't play a lot of transaction operations. It's not that excited. It likes to play more assets a lot of the time. It's also worth noting Celebrity Gift is the other like way in faction to get economy in Jinteki, and I'm not a big fan of Celebrity Gift. Not only is it kind of slow as a double, but it shows most of HQ to the runner, which is a huge amount of information. And if I either have to discard an extra card or show my whole hand to the corporation, I'll probably pick the discarded card with Hansei Review, and I'm favoring that over Celebrity Gift. Again, I'm interested to see how much play this gets. It's kind of hard to evaluate the Hansei Review because throwing out a card in the early game can be quite difficult, but that burst money on 5 is really, really quite nice. There's going to be some huge turns, but any of the huge turns where somebody plays like Hedge Fund into Hansei Review, that's going to be most of your hand thrown out. So you're going to need a lot of card draw to support this, but 1 influence gain 5. I think there's a lot of reasons people will try and play this. All right. Our last Jinteki operation. This is Neurospike. It's a gray ops, which is a fun subtype that doesn't actually mean much. It's flavorfully mostly. And it says do X net damage where X is equal to the sum of the printed agenda points on agendas you scored this turn. It's 3 influence. It has some flavor text. It says macro scale developments within the net decouple the prior informational states. Surplus entropy is then gifted where it will do the most good. I don't think I'm clever enough to understand that, but it's actually one of my favorite pieces of art from System Gateway, so I'll appreciate the pretty picture. And we've talked a bit about how Neurospike works within System Gateway, and we're going to go over that really quick, but there's a lot of support cards for it as well. In short, you want to get to a situation in which you have 1 click left, in which you can score a 5/3 agenda, which in System Gateway will be send a message, and then you'll have usually 2 clicks left. So the idea is that you have a send a message on the table with 4 advancements that you've been slowly whittling away at. And then your turn starts and you say advance, you score it, and then you play a Neurospike, and then you play another Neurospike, and the runner takes 6 net damage. And cards like this are really appealing because people see this and they represent a whole win condition, an entire new way to build a deck that can deliver wins. And anytime you see like this, you know that people are going to show up at tournaments and play a deck that follows that or that tries to follow that plan because it's new and fun and exciting. And I think this one's actually not a bad way. It's not a bad win condition. I think there's a lot of decks that can pretty consistently kill runners, can flatline runners with Neurospike. Let's talk a bit about how that works. So in System Gateway, that's the threat, right? Anything with 4 advancements on it could be advanced Neurospike with 5/3 agendas, or of course, it can be an Urtica Cipher. And if the runner calls that incorrectly, they're going to get hurt. So that's fantastic. I love that fork, and it's live and well within System Gateway. You also have Malaper Data Vault for 3 influence in Gateway. The idea is that whenever you score an agenda from the server, you can take a card from your deck, put it in your hand. So even if you have a single Neurospike in hand, you can score your send a message. Before you score it, res the Malaper Data Vault, pull 1 Neurospike from hand, have the other one already there, boom, they're dead. And any sort of combo card, any sort of combo deck like this wants to be holding a lot of cards in hand. You have 2 Neurospikes that are going to be in your hand for the whole game. So cards like Sprint help a heck of a lot because it allows you to draw into your Neurospikes really quickly. And then if you're drawing into agendas, but you have no goals to score them anytime soon because you're working on this Neurospike combo, you can shuffle them back. Sprint is fantastic. You also have a seamless launch, which is really important because now you have that threat a bit earlier. If you even have a triple advanced send a message, you could do seamless launch, score, Neurospike, and that's a lot easier too. Sometimes 3 advancements is easier than 4 advancements. That's pretty straightforward. There's also some interesting things. If the runner is tagged, you have orbital superiority in System Gateway into Neurospike. Sometimes they take 4 net damage and then you need a single Neurospike to do the last 2, which is fun. I haven't seen this happen, but maybe there's some cool plays there that involve public trail, score, Neurospike, but that's nice and good. So in System Gateway, I think there's a bunch of ways to deliver a Neurospike lethal. Most of them hinge on send a message, but you do have a heck of a lot of support to let you get there. And for 3 influence, you could consider playing this anywhere, even maybe precision design, having that hand size and that ability to recur combo parts. Maybe that's even good enough. Now, if that sounds strong as a runner, what do you do about it? And then System Gateway, you actually have some pretty strong ways to deal with it. Firstly, Carnivore and Lou. You know the Neurospikes are going to be in hand for a while. If you can even trash a single Neurospike, they're not going to be able to kill you. They need 2. So if they only have 1 in hand, it's going to be pretty hard for the lethal to be delivered. So just putting the pressure on HQ, trashing those operations, you're good. You can also always run the remote too if you think there's an agenda there. And finally, T400 Memory Diamond, you can install this and have +1 hand size. So as long as you have 6 cards in hand, you're really forcing the corp to score with 3 clicks left to do triple Neurospike, which is very difficult and also pretty expensive. So just having 6 hand size and making sure you have enough cards in hand can get you around that. At least you won't die, you might lose your whole hand. That's cool. I'm a big Neurospike fan. I've been talking about this card like pretty excitedly in all the other corp reviews so far, and I'm going to continue talking about it excitedly going forward, but it's fantastic. It's just another win condition that delivers that Jinteki bite is fantastic. Now, outside out of Gateway, how does this work in Standard? Well, there's a 4-3 agenda. That's kind of fun. You can get this up to 2 advancements, install advance, and then if they don't run it, you can do seamless launch Neurospike. They can be dead as soon as turn 2. No, you probably don't have enough money. They can be dead as soon as turn 4, realistically. Wow, that's really cool. And not every, but most factions actually have a good way in faction to deliver Neurospike lethals. Jinteki has Obokata Protocol. It gets on the table, has 4 advancements on it. Now the runner can run and steal it, and then take 4 net damage from this and maybe a 5th from Personal Evolution, which is pretty hard. Or if they don't, you score this. They take 1 damage from Jinteki Personal Evolution, followed by 2 Neurospikes. That's pretty scary. You have Bacterial Programming, which we've talked about a bit before. The idea is you can have a single Neurospike in hand, and then you can score this, and then hope you find your second one in the top 7 cards of your deck. You're pretty likely to, maybe even find 2, but that's pretty wild. You also have cards like Sting, which on our own don't do too much to help the Neurospike, but when you score this, you can generally do a lot of damage already because of its triggered ability when scored and maybe Personal Evolution, and then maybe you do 2 Neurospikes for 2 damage and that's lethal. This stuff actually can work even well in Glacier decks. La Costa Grid is pretty fun. You install a card in the La Costa Grid server and it gets a free advancement. And next turn it gets a free advancement. And at that point, you still have to advance it. Third turn, it has to get an advancement. And if you're not scoring anything, a lot of the times it looks like a Biovault that you're just putting additional advancements on. And the runner might not expect it. And then suddenly you score an Obokata that you paid no money to advance, the La Costa did for free, and they die to double Neurospikes. That's good fun. You can also work with Complete Image, which is kind of cool, but a bit trickier to play without Cronus Protocol. And it's worth noting that all this stuff involving 5-3 agendas, when it's like steal an Obokata to take 5 damage, this also pairs with Punitive Counterstrike. And I think it's really potent to put these 2 win conditions in your deck. If they don't run it, Neurospike is a lethal, and if they do run it, Punitive Counterstrike is a lethal. Now, these might compete for slots in your HQ, which, you know, you can only carry so many of these combo cards, but it's a pretty potent win condition, and you have to play around it. Now, transitioning into Wayland, we have CityWorks Project, an agenda that you very bravely install face up, and then you put a lot of advancement counters on it, sometimes with dedication ceremonies. And then you're saying, oh, runner, if you want to run this, you have to take 8 net meat damage. And if they don't run it, score Neurospike. We've done this on the channel. It's worked out pretty well for us. Also within Wayland, you have Consulting Visit. So even if you don't have a Neurospike in hand, you can always spend 2 clicks to go find it from your deck and play it, which is quite nice. Jemison also, a very fun combo deck, but out of nowhere, you can suddenly put advancement counters on upgrades. Maybe it's or on agendas. So out of nowhere, they might not expect you to res an Oberth Protocol to put 3 advancements on a card that's been barely there. And then suddenly they're dead to score into Neurospikes. And you can do some really fun stuff. Surprisingly enough, and we died to this pretty recently on stream, Re-Education, a 5-3 in NBN. If you score this, you can shuffle a bunch of cards from HQ to bottom R&D and draw that many cards. So if you have 6 in hand, you can shuffle away 5, keep a Neurospike in hand, maybe you draw a Neurospike, and then the runner only has 1 card in hand, or 0 cards in hand even, and you Neurospike them. And they're dead. And we were playing against this in an Acme Consulting that would very aggressively get a remote server, and they're considered tagged when they're hitting their ice. So this Data Ward is just a behemoth in the early game. And you score a Re-Education into a single Neurospike and they die. And the fact that this card needs a single Neurospike makes this so much more consistent compared to all the other combos that we talked about that generally require double Neurospike. So this Re-Education is quite terrifying. And lastly, I'm just going to shout out Wayland because, HB, and it's not a really strong Neurospike deck, but you could score a Luminal in System Gateway and then have 3 extra clicks to play 3 Neurospikes. That'd be fun. Does this seem really strong? It potentially could be. And again, I think people are going to show up with tournaments with these sort of decks and you have to prepare for them. But luckily there's some pretty good tech that you can just put into your deck. If you're an Anarch in Standard, you have access to I've Had Worse, which is an incredibly ubiquitous card. And this is tricky, because if they hit one of these with the Neurospike, it's very unlikely for them to have lethal, and they've just paid a bunch and scored their agenda, and they're not going to kill you. Some decks are putting Salon's Hospitality just to get rid of those I've Had Worses, but it makes it a lot more clunky, and you need a lot more clicks. And Shaper Onacom is kind of nice, because if they trash an event from hand, even through damage by a Neurospike combo, you'll draw a card. And a lot of times that means that on 5 cards in hand, you actually will survive double Neurospike, because they'll probably trash an event, you'll draw one, they hit it with a Neurospike, you're going to live. And outside of that, for 1 influence and 0 cost, you have No One Home, which means the first damage you take will be a trace if you want it, and then if you boost more money than the corp, you'll take no damage. It's a bit weaker against Personal Evolution, but pretty good against the rest of them. And then you also have Caldera, which says infinite money equals infinite protection. So there's ways around it, but I'm promising you, you'll find a Neurospike deck sooner or later, and it's going to surprise you the first time you die, and then the second time you're going to be scared of every advanceable card. And that's a really cool thing, that we had that sort of fear of advanceable cards classically when it came to things like Ronin, but Ronin only goes so far. A single Ronin can only do 3 net damage, but now a single card with 3 or 4 advancements on it is a real threat to being double Neurospike out of nowhere. And I find the paranoia sinking in a lot of games that I'm playing. So just the existence of Neurospike and the fact that it's playable in, I think, 3 out of the 4 factions kind of shakes things up. And I'm interested to see how people react to it, or how big of the meta becomes a Neurospike meta. I don't think it's going to be a big thing, but I think the yellow, the re-education one, seems quite something. And that's the thing too, if you find a re-education in an NBN deck, oh god, get prepared for lethal. This is Anoetic Void. It is an upgrade. It's unique, which means you can only have 1 resed at a time. It costs 0 to res, only single to trash, a whopping 4 influence. And it says, whenever the runner approaches this server, you may pay 2 credits and trash 2 cards from HQ. If you do, end the run. This flavor text says, the self-evolving net twists into space unthought and unthinkable. Realms of gods and other info hazards, mocking our sacrifices to petty casualty. And it's quoted from the conceptual frameworks for applied theology, which is interesting. Now, the name Anoetic, I've said that wrong a lot. I think a lot of people will continue to say it wrong, as will I. It comes from the word anoesis. Anosis, I don't know how to say this, which in psychology refers to the theoretical condition in which there is feeling without understanding. And this shows up in some medical texts as the idea of, again, feeling without understanding. Humans can feel things without understanding what they are. And we have a void. Maybe it's the void in which we can't feel and also can't understand. I don't know. I really like this art. So this harkens back to, again, a reprint, and specifically a reprint of one of the strongest cards in all of Netrunner. And I've been saying that hyperbole a lot, but I think I haven't been doing it for fun. It's true. This is Caprice Nisei. She's one of the clones. She's a Psy clone. And because she plays a Psy game, when you make a successful run, or when you pass all the ice on a remote server, which Caprice is installed in, you have to play a Psy game. And Psy games were a pretty common thing back in the day in Jinteki cards, where the runner and the corp would secretly hide 0, 1, or 2 credits, and you'd reveal them. And if the runner spent a different number of credits than the corp would end the run. So that means, besides any any sort of like predictive reads and any bluffing, the corp should win that 66% of the time. So we had a card that went into a remote server behind some very taxing ice that the runner could run to just have a 33% chance of getting through. And that makes running the remote very difficult. And this card was such a menace. This is Dan Dargenio's winning deck list. It was a Replicating Perfection deck list back in 2014. That was their strategy. Build up a remote server with some really good ice at the time. Even had some really strong ice, and then you put Caprice Nisei back there. You had 3 copies of it. And if they trashed Caprice Nisei, you'd bring it back. And it's really hard to run the remote server. A lot of times you have to try and win off central servers, and it's worth noting you could put Caprice on a central server if you really needed to. 1 year later, we've pivoted out of Jinteki to HB. This is Engineering the Future. And this isn't Dan Dargenio's world's winning deck list from 2015, which he did, mind you, do it 2 years in a row. But this is a very similar list from Dave Hoyland, who came in 3rd. And the same idea. It's Engineering the Future in HB, and we're spending 8 influence on 2 copies of Caprice Nisei. Our idea was to build a good remote server. Early game would have some assets in it that gave us economy, and in the late game, you'd have to get through an assassin. Oh, I forgot that they ran assassin, architect, or sorry, Eli and Ichi, and then play a Caprice game. And this card on its own made this sort of mid-range ice-based glacier deck work. Because one of the best things you can do to the quality of your ice is not play better ice, not play more ice, but once the runner gets to the ice, you end the run. Okay, we'll talk about it in a bit more organized, but this looks to be like a terrifyingly powerful card, and it largely is. The first time I played this on table, playing like the system gateway stuff casually, my partner I played against read the card after I ended the run once they got through the ice and said, "Are you kidding? That's a Netrunner card?" And I think that sort of reaction is going to be elicited from a bunch of people when they see this, because it is an immense effect that kind of breaks all the rules in Netrunner to some extent. All right, so firstly, there's a real cost associated with this. When the runner gets through all the ice, as a corp, you have to pay 2 credits and trash 2 cards from HQ, and that is a limited thing you can do. Most corps only have 5 cards in hand, so most of the times, if you can run the server 3 times, which is a lot, you're going to get through. And each time you do that, you're making the corp throw out cards, and that's a real cost. Again, if we're talking about restoring humanity, if we talk about restoring humanity, we're going to get a credit from this. All right, it's another card that works with it. Cool. Sick. Another thing that's really important to know is that the timing structure of this, and we talked about this when we talked about Managarm Skunkworks, it says when the runner approaches the server. And it's worth noting that when the runner approaches the server, once this happens, there's no paid ability windows after that. And that was one of the big strengths of Caprice Nisei, is that the runner, classically in Netrunner, could play the side game of Caprice, win the side game of Caprice, and then the corp could just say, no, and use a Nisei Mark II token to end the run. And you have to keep in mind that with Anoetic Void, after the runner gets through this, if they do get through this, there's no paid ability window to do something like a Nisei Mark II. So if they're getting through, they're getting through. You have to use the Nisei Mark II token first. Also, with multiple things that have approach the server clauses like Managarm Skunkworks in the same server as an Anoetic Void, as the corp, you can choose the order in which the runner has to hit these. So you always say, hit the Managarm Skunkworks first. The runner's going to have to either lose 2 clicks or pay 5 credits. And then after that, the corp will pay 2 and trash 2 cards to end the run. This is a very common combo outside of System Gateway as well as within. People are calling it the Skunk Void as a nice portmanteau, but you have to watch out. That's very, very strong. And I said this a bit before clumsily, but just think about this, right? If you have a piece of ice on a remote server, and I think this is a really good example because this will never really end the run. If you have a single brawn on a remote server, the runner can spend their whole turn clicking through it. And once they do get through it, they hit the Anoetic Void and you say no, you throw 2, pay 2, and the run is over. And what I'm saying is a lot of times Anoetic Void is better protection on your server than more ice. You can put 2 ice on a remote server and a lot of times Anoetic Void will be more taxing than anything else. Because if they want to get through the Anoetic Void, they're probably going to have to run it 2 or 3 times. And that additional cost, not only on credits or clicks, is a lot better than putting a 3rd piece of ice on your remote server. So that's really important. Now to fire this, you have to throw out 2 cards and 2 credits, and I think that's a real cost. Firstly, throwing out cards from hand, that means you have less options and less opportunities. It also means that you have agendas in hand. Those are going to pile up. So if the runner's charging in with a Docklands Pass and you had to throw out 2 cards, now you have 3 cards in hand, one of them being an agenda, that agenda is probably going to get stolen. So you have to watch out what you throw out. That being said, this is the set that has a Spin Doctor in it. So a lot of times throwing out agendas isn't that bad if you have a Spin Doctor on the table because you can still resuscitate them. You can bring them back into R&D. On top of that, this has happened to me where I've seen, oh, the corp only has 3 cards in hand. So I'm going to be able to run the Anoetic Void twice this turn. I run it once, spend a bunch of money breaking ice, and then they throw out 2 cards. I run again with 1 card in hand, and then out of nowhere, they res a Spin Doctor in server 4, and suddenly my run is ended again, and my turn as well. And that's really, really important. So Spin Doctor is doubly flexible in all these decks because it gives you that extra cards and lets you redraw cards, but also recur the things that you've thrown away. So I think there's a real cost associated with Anoetic Void, but there's no way around it that this is an incredibly strong effect. And we talked about this when it came to Urtica Cipher. The runner at some point, if you're not doing anything, is going to have all the breakers and a lot of money. And this is one of the only cards in the whole system gateway that says, I don't care. and they're going to need to run the server multiple times and maybe run out of money eventually. And it's a really big deal. This is the one card that in almost every system gateway deck that I'm building, I'm spending 4 or 8 influence putting it into my HB deck or into my NBN deck, because this is the strongest remote protection ability in the whole gateway. Also, it works well in precision design because you have extra cards. Now, one thing I am going to recommend, because this looks like a very strong card, and I don't see enough people do this, I think, is one of the best things you can do is actually run this remote server when there's nothing in it that it's protecting. So the idea is that you have an Anoetic Void in the remote server with some ice, and somebody installs an agenda and advances the agenda. And then next turn, they score the agenda. This following turn is a really good time to run the Anoetic Void, because if there's an agenda in the remote server, you know the corporation is going to fire the ability, spend 2 credits, two cards. But when there's nothing in the remote server, it actually becomes a lot harder for them to spend the cards and credits protecting this. Specifically, if the turn before you've ran it and they've spent some cards and credits, they're not going to have a lot of cards in hand. And so putting the pressure on there is also pretty good thing to do. On top of that, if you're running it when there's nothing in the remote server besides the Anoetic Void, and the corp that turn spends cards and credits to protect it, if they draw an agenda off the top of their deck, they're in an awkward situation, because the following turn, they don't have enough cards in hand to use the Anoetic Void to its full ability on the following turn, let alone they just drew an agenda into an HQ of 1 of 2 cards. So they either jam it now or draw up and hope that the agenda gets lost in more cards in HQ, if you know what I mean. So do pay in mind, as strong as this card is, one of the best things you can do is pressure it when there's no agenda in there, because then it becomes way more expensive for the corp to protect. Now, outside of a system gateway, there are some good ways to deal with this. Political operative looks really strong right now for so many reasons. And the idea is that if you run HQ, install a pol-op, as we call it, anytime that the corp reses an Anoetic Void on the remote server, you can pay 1 to trash it. Also, HQ, it's worth noting central pressure is really strong too. If you're seeing cards from R&D specifically, you can trash that Anoetic Void for 1. And if you end up trashing it, it's not going to show up into the remote server. So that's really good. On top of political operative, you have cards like Councilman, which are a bit more niche, but you can install Councilman, run the remote. You also have things like Lucky Charm, which I think are kind of playable and criminal. The idea is that if you run HQ, you can install this, or sorry, if you run HQ in a turn, then when you run a remote, you can use the Lucky Charm when they end the run with the Anoetic Void, and you can come back in. Same goes for always have a backup plan, but this is a bit of a harder card to play, I think. So if you find yourself losing to Anoetic Void, there are tech cards against it. Within Startup, you do have that Lucky Charm and have a backup plan. Within Standard, you have Political Operative, which seems incredibly strong. But also in Standard, oh my God, you have Restore. You want to put this in that sort of like ETF-esque food coats, mid-range HB deck. Someone trashes your Anoetic Void, you pay 1 credit to bring it back. You res it for 0. Seems really good. Seems quite good. I think this is one of the strongest cards in all of Gateway. And it's going to put so much power into the sort of decks that want to score agendas behind ice. And it doesn't even have to be agendas, right? Like if you want to play like a clearinghouse deck and you want to just protect your clearinghouse until it gets to 6 advancements, this is not a bad way to do it. And you have a lot of cool ways, like even Anoetic Void to protect your agenda that I guess it's kind of hard if you're trying to protect an agenda to Neurospike them, because if they run it, you have to throw cards out in hand and you need the Neurospikes in hand. But it's incredibly powerful. But that 2 cards and 2 credits, that's a real cost. So if you can pressure the economy or pressure cards in hand, it's a lot harder to use. So these are the 8 Jinteki cards within System Gateway. We're going to go through 2 neutral cards in just a couple minutes, but just to recap over this set of cards, I think there's some really cool things going on here. Firstly, I need to give a big shout out to Urtica Cipher and Neurospike, and then the 5/3 agenda triangle, and the fact that these 3 cards work so well together, and they really enhance and encourage the install, advance a trap play as compared to some of the original core sets. It's such a big deal to me. In some of the original core sets where you had these traps, you do install, advance, and then maybe later you'd continue to advance them. But if the runner didn't run them, nothing really bad happened. This was before Ronin. You just didn't have to deal with them if the runner didn't run them. And a lot of times I felt really bad install, advancing a June bug when nothing happened from it. And I really like that within this very small pool of cards, you still have the threat of Neurospike and even Clearinghouse, where if you install double advance a trap, you can still commit to the trap and not feel terrible about it. Because once it gets more and more advanced, the runner's still more and more scared of it. And I really, really like that. Now, Anoetic Void, I think, is going to be incredibly powerful outside of Gateway, on top of within System Gateway. And I think Hansei Review is going to be a pretty important card. But the agenda and the ice and even the identity itself, I'm not too excited about. It's something we haven't talked about too much, but the identity in terms of theme and flavor, it doesn't land exactly for me. The secrecy of face down cards in archives is okay, but right now it comes more to an economic question of whether I should run archives to deny a credit potentially, as opposed to, ooh, are there cool tricks or traps within archives? I think the biggest bummer to me, and I'm really excited to hear for those who have learned what Jinteki is through System Gateway, is that I think what Jinteki represented in this card pool is actually pretty different than the original core set. And I think it's only one card. One card is the biggest difference here, and that's Snare. Snare is an immensely powerful card, and this has existed in every single core set, and Snare really changes how accesses work. As every single corp within System Gateway, if the runner accesses HQ, I'm holding my cards in my hand. If the runner accesses R&D, I flip the top card up for them to see. I'm just dreading it. It can only be bad. Besides maybe send a message at the right time, but it's only can be bad. It's either it's an agenda or they just say nothing and they put it back. But Snare existing in the core set was such a wild difference. You would hold Snares in hand as Jinteki and you'd be excited when the runner in HQ. You'd basically have this trap you've set up. It's been brewing. There's always this threat of any R&D access could be a Snare, which would buy you that window to jam an agenda. But nothing like that exactly exists within Jinteki, the Jinteki right now in System Gateway. And it might be hard to print another card like Snare, and maybe specifically Nisei wanted to ensure that a card like this didn't exist. A card that said, oh, you access the central server with only 2 cards in hand. The game is now over. Maybe that was something they didn't want to happen to newer players so that they could maybe not feel like they're blown out on turn 1, on game 1 or game 2 where they didn't respect the hand size thing. But I feel like that was a really big part of learning Jinteki to me, and a really exciting part as well for both the runner and the corp. And I feel like that is a bit absent from here. Maybe it's just a bit of excitement that I'm missing. I don't know. I'm really excited to hear what you think. But these are the Jinteki cards, and there's 2 more cards I want to highlight. They're neutral cards that I think are going to find a lot of play within Jinteki decks. And let's start here with Offworld Office. It's a neutral 4/2 agenda. It's an expansion subtype, which is largely just flavor. And it says, when you score this agenda, gain 7 credits. As the first lunar city, Highline was built on the dreams of a new frontier and boundless opportunity. But helium-3 mining is too lucrative for the corpse to ever relinquish control. So this is a neutral agenda that gives economy, which within System Gateway, this is the most exciting agenda to score in System Gateway from my experience. So in System Gateway, if you're playing with all the neutral agendas at the beginning of the game of you learning, this is the good one. You score this 4/2, you get 7 credits, you're excited. Even when you add all the in-faction agendas, I still find Offworld Office to be 9 out of 10 times the most exciting agenda, the happiest agenda you are to score. And for that reason, 10 out of 10. It's really, really great. Now, having a neutral agenda that gives you 7 credits is kind of a throwback to some old Netrunner stuff. This is Corporate War, a card that showed up also in original Netrunner that says if you've scored this, if you have at least 7 credits, gain 7 credits. But if you don't, lose all your money, which is really difficult to play. And it also kind of replaces another card, Corporate Sales Team, that still exists in Standard that says it's a 4/2. When scored, put 10 credits on this. And at the beginning of each player's turn, you take a credit off of it. So it gives you a bit more money, but it's a bit slower. I think modernly, a lot of people would rather play Offworld Office than the Corporate Sales Team. So I'm not sure where they're going to see the Corporate Sales Team anymore. And this is really good. It's also really good in System Gateway with the release of Seamless Launch, because you don't have to install Advanced Remote. You can just install it in a remote, and next turn, Seamless Launch, Advance. And then you're paying 3 credits to gain 7. So you score an agenda, and on top of that, get at least a sure gamble worth of value. And that's absolutely fantastic. Now, it's worth saying in Standard right now, this card is seeing play, but it's competing with another slot, and that's the Cyberdeck Sandbox slot. This is another neutral agenda that was released somewhat recently from Nisei, and it says the first time you purge fires counters every turn, gain 4 credits, and when you score it, you also purge. So I find in a deck, if you're not playing both of these 4/2 agendas, you need to figure out which one works better for you. And I find like a lot of times Cyberdeck Sandbox actually looks better. The first sandbox you score, you purge immediately and gain 4 credits. And purging immediately is also quite nice because you can purge things. And runners are running viruses right now. Amakua, Conduit, both of these get purged for not spending 3 clicks. That's already an immense amount of value. On top of that, you get 4 credits. On top of that, you can also run more virus support cards, and these get a lot better when that Trace 4 Purge Virus Counters gives you 4 credits, so this is looking quite good. On top of that, when you score the second Cyberdeck Sandbox, you then get 8 credits every time you purge, let alone when you score it. So I think these are very comparable. If you purge at least once with Sandbox, it's generally comparable to Offworld Office, if not better, but you have to figure out which one of these goes into your deck. Now, the issue we're running right now into competitive standard Netrunner is that people are running both of these. This is Seamless Rush. It's a deck that was one of the first well-performing decks in the new meta after System Gateway released. And you notice this deck is running 3 Sandbox and 2 Offworld Office. And the big reason, again, is that we have Seamless Launch in this deck, is that we can score agendas really quickly without investing a lot into them. On top of that, we have La Costa Grid, which gets free advancement counters. And you're just seeing this in everywhere. Everywhere right now is running these sort of things. This is a Cyberdeck Sandbox deck, but I think the reason I want to point out right now is we're in a really weird situation where there's a fair few competitive decks that are running more neutral agendas than in-faction agendas. This deck is running 3 Sandbox, 2 Offworld Office, and then only 3 in-faction agendas, 2 Ikoa, 1 Luminal Transubstantiation. This Simon Moon's best Asa list right now is running 3 Global Foods and 3 Sandboxes, and only 3 Vitruvius. These decks are running more neutral agendas than in faction. This is an Offworld Skunkworks deck, a similar idea, 3 Sandbox, 3 GFI, 2 Offworld, and a single HB agenda. And this might be a problem. The idea that factions are more interested in playing the neutral stuff means that they don't play the in-faction stuff. And in-faction agendas are meant to be not only very thematically linked to what you're playing, but also are meant to be kind of strong and interesting and interact well with the other things you want to do in faction. But the fact is that the neutral stuff right now just looks very good and is very easily played, that there might be some decks that are not even running any. There's arguments to build a deck's list of agenda suites that doesn't even run any in-faction agendas. You could run 3 global food initiatives, sandboxes, and off-world offices. That's wild. But the fact that now like all these cool HB agendas aren't getting played because all the neutral stuff is better is probably a design issue. Now, one really cool thing we can say about Offworld Office is that neutral cards that give you neutral agendas also specifically that give you credits are really good for people who want to build wild and weird stuff. One of the problems with Netrunner is on the corp side, you're very restricted. There's a lot of limitations on or not limitations, but there's a lot of things you have to check off when building a competent deck. You need to put amount of agendas in there. You need to put amount of ice, and then you need to put amount of econ, and then on top of that, then you can play your fun stuff. But this deck doesn't have it because it's an old deck, but Offworld Office represents a really cool thing where it's an agenda you can put in just about anything to ensure that not only do you have an agenda, but you can have some economy. So you can go on and do some sillier stuff and then put wild stuff in the slots that might have been your economy slots. And this on its own is an agenda, or sorry, a deck that only runs neutral cards, which I guess Offworld Office is really well slotted to. We saw this not long ago in a card called SSL Endorsement, a 5/3 agenda that would give you 9 credits when scored or stolen. And this would show up in just about every deck, which is really good because then it's easier to build decks that have a certain amount of economy in them without having to play some of the like more standard good economy stuff that shows up pretty ubiquitously across decks. But SSL Endorsement was showing up at too many decks, and now it's banned. If I slide down, you see it's banned right now. And that's because it was just too good and too easy to play. Back in the day, we had a 4/2 agenda like this. This was an NAPD contract, which cost 4 credits to steal. And the economy back in the day was a bit more limited than it is now. And these were actually kind of a struggle to steal. And just about every deck would play this. And this, at some point, got restricted. And I'm not even sure if it got banned, but it ended up being a restricted card because it was so powerful. I feel like we're in the exact same situation right now, where cards like Sandbox might be a bit more of an issue, but Offworld Office as well are representing 4/2 agendas that are just so good and so easy to play. They're showing up in everything and taking the slots of in-faction agendas. So agenda suites across factions are getting a bit more homogenous, and that might be an issue. Another thing some people are quick to point out as well is that we've seen a lot of agendas recently that are on-tempo agendas. So this is a Bologna, another 5/3 agenda, or excuse me, a 5/3 agenda that has a defensive ability, but when you score it, you gain 5 credits. So you don't actually end up spending money on this. And Offworld Office is a very good example of Sandbox. One of the big conceits originally in Netrunner, and it's one of the cool design parts of this game, is that if most corps wanted to score an agenda, basically advance themselves towards their win condition, it would cost them clicks and credits to advance the agendas. So the idea is that if I wanted to score out my Nisei Mark II from server 1, I would have to spend 4 credits and 4 clicks. And the fact that I'm spending this money and time gives the runner a chance, if they can't steal that agenda, to catch up, right? The idea is that all agendas represented an investment of economy. And with cards like Offworld Office, Cyberdeck Sandbox, and even Bologna, you can actually build a deck of all tempo positive agendas that when you score puts you immediately further ahead. And that can be an issue because that makes the game a lot faster. Corps don't have to recover after scoring an agenda. They can score an agenda and next turn have the economy to be ready to res ice and score another agenda. There's no more downtime. And that can be really exciting for like that explosive play. And we've heard from the Nisi designers that they want the games to be a bit shorter, and this is a really nice way to get there. I'm not saying that spending turns clicking for credits is fun. I don't want to do that, and this helps you not do that. But it's a bit interesting because we've kind of slid maybe away into another side where all of these decks, they're just playing only tempo positive agendas and they're off to the races. It's worth noting too, Violet Level Clearance recently got banned, and that was kind of like a pretty important card in these sort of like tempo positive agenda decks. So these might slow down a bit. So if they look really strong right now, they might not in the future look as strong, but this is something that I'm interested to see. And I feel like Cyberdeck Sandbox will probably be banned, if anything, before Offworld Office, but 4-2 on tempo agendas, they're here and anybody can play them. So I feel like everybody will play them. Finally, let's talk about Tithe. This is a little small sentry. It's AP, it's going to hurt you. Costs 1 to res, 1 strength, and has 2 subroutines, do 1 net damage, and gain 1 credit. You'll give till it hurts, then it'll reach for more. Red Coman. Real quick, Red Coman, I had to look this up, but John Coman III of Badenoch, also nicknamed Red, of the Coman family, was a leading Scottish baron and magnate who played an important role in the First War of Scottish Independence. I don't know much more about the history, whether this sort of like tithing was a thing. Mind you, tithe is a term that shows up. I've heard it largely with the religious institutions or with like feudal society, in which I think tithe classically was a tenth of your income or your produce would go to the lord, the baron, the church, whoever ruled over you. So this is the tithe. On top of that, this art is from Scott Aminga, and Scott Aminga did all the art for all the neutral ice across System Gateway, and it's all fantastic. And specifically, a huge shout out to Scott Aminga. Right now, there's something going on within the community called the Project Katara. It's called Project Katara, and the Katara was the last cycle of that FFG did in Netrunner's history, and unfortunately, it's really hard to find because it wasn't out for very long before Netrunner was discontinued from FFG, so it didn't have a very extensive print run. So the Project Katara is a group project of which people are making alt arts for the entire Katara cycle, which is 120 cards, just so that it can be released from areas like Make Playing Cards, so that everyone can get their hands on printed Katara cards. And Scott Aminga has been a huge contributor to this. And you see very consistently, this is 6 hours ago, Scott is publishing art that they're giving or contributing to the Project Katara cycle. This is an art for the Crypt. This is the plague, forget it. And this is Amor, and there's some really good stuff here. This art is fantastic. BioVault, oh man, RNG key, it's so good. So huge shout out to Scott Aminga. Not only is the art fantastic, but getting involved and helping making Netrunner more accessible is amazing. But what's this ice do? It's a little cheap, annoying ice. It's a taxing ice, we'd call it. It's not the sort of end the run ice you want to put on your remote server. You put this on the central server, and it does 2 things: 1 net damage and gains a credit. And it's kind of a mixture between 2 little annoying ice of old. You have Pup, which just rotated out. Yip, the little dog says, and you either have to pay 1 credit or do 1 net damage twice over. And Pop-Up Window, which when you get through it, the corp makes money and you lose money or end the run. And it's kind of a mixture. It's a pup and a pop. Pwop. I regret saying that. And it's good. It's annoying. It's just annoying enough. It's worth noting these 2 subroutines are not always equally relevant at all board states. Gain a credit for the corp doesn't matter sometimes. If the corp is on a small amount of credits, they're on 2, 3, 4 credits, that gain a credit is probably worth breaking, because a lot of the econ cards, the corp needs to be on 4 or 5 credits. They need to be on 5 credits to play things like Hedge Fund, Hansei Review. So when they're on low credits, there's very little they can do. You want to keep them on low credits. But if the corp is on 16, 17 credits, you can probably let them have an 18th credit. It doesn't change too much about the game, so make sure you're not always breaking this when it's not necessary. The same goes for the net damage, and we talked about this. There's a difference right now between like the original Jinteki core sets and System Gateway. Net damage is annoying if you lose an important card, and it's also annoying because you have to spend a click generally to draw into a new card. But if you're running a central server, there's nothing within the central server in System Gateway that's going to do additional net damage. So you can safely access with few cards in hand. Now, that being said, having few cards in hand can be an issue for Neurospike and stuff like that in the future. But again, you don't always have to break that. Sometimes it's actually cheaper to lose a card than it is to spend credits breaking it, which you need for the ice further down the server. So keep that in mind. And within System Gateway, you're generally breaking this for 2 credits. Echelon breaks it for 2. Carmen breaks for 2. Nothing really to say about that. And cards like Pup actually did see play back in the day. This was an annoying enough card to put on your central servers to slow the runner down for getting cheap accesses. You pay 1, they pay 2. That's a good trade. And Tithe kind of feels the same way. But again, there's issues right now in standard format where why play Tithe when I can play an Engram Flush or even a slot machine, and that kind of does well for you. So it's a thing. Tithe also in standard, honestly, it's kind of hard to break. Well, not hard, but it's annoying to break. If you're trying to get through this with an MK Ultra, you're paying 3 credits for 1 res. That's fantastic. But albeit Book Ultra breaks it for free even the first time it turns. So you're going to get some mixed value here. Now, I think one big thing I really want to say when it comes to Tithe is if you're playing in System Gateway and you play against Tau, don't install them. Don't put them down. Don't install them. Don't even res them. Do nothing. Throw them out. And this is a really important thing. Tau is very a specific runner that can take or can reposition your ice. So a lot of times the best place for a Tithe is just to put it on HQ to make those HQ accesses a bit more annoying, or put them on archives so that when they're running to get that flip value from Restoring Humanity, it's just a bit more annoying and a bit less worth it. That's a really good place to put Tithe. But with Tau, when you score or steal an agenda, they'll go ahead and put that Tithe on your scoring remote. And it's really hard to score agendas behind this thing. So against Tau, kind of figure out what you're going to install and what you're not going to install, and probably just throw those Tithes out, which is a bummer. Now, the only thing I want to say about Tithe, which is hard to see a deck in standard that this is going to see play, is that it's a sentry and requires a breaker to break it. And this is probably not the best example, but this is an NBN controlling the message deck, and this classically ran pop-up window, which is still right now in the standard card pool. But the idea is that if you want that sort of annoying, cheap thing that gives you money, you might consider it a Tithe, and that's largely because it's a sentry. And right now, NBN doesn't have too many good sentries that force a breaker out of the runner. This deck played Cobra for specifically that same reason. A lot of times people would run against NBN without having a killer. So that trash program was pretty relevant back in the day out of nowhere. So you could consider playing a Tithe as a reason to force a runner to install a killer in a matchup where the killer isn't very relevant and still have sometimes that pseudo pop-up ability. Again, I don't think that's fantastic, but that's the closest I can come to this, because right now, if I want annoying things on central servers, there's a fair few better things to do. But hopefully over time that'll change and we'll reevaluate this, because there was a time where Pup showed up as a 2-of in a lot of Jinteki decks, and Tithe is very well positioned to set up that role. In fact, in some ways it's better because Pup didn't require a breaker, while Tithe very much does. I think Tithe is also the best net damage ice. Well, it's better than Diviner. I feel like it's way more consistent than Diviner at what it does, which is I'm going to put it on central servers and it's going to be annoying. And yeah, Karuna's good though. Karuna can be pretty taxing to break. That's all. That's all the cards. That's all of them. We're talking about 10 cards today. Again, the Jinteki stuff, I really like some parts of it. I think some other parts don't exactly deliver the Jinteki experience that I'm going to say grew up with, but again, maybe I'm pedantic, maybe I'm being a bit harsh about that. I'm really interested to see how people are finding playing Jinteki, how often the Urtica Ciphers are firing, how often the Neurospike lethals are connecting. So again, anything that you feel strongly about, I would love to hear in the comments. If there's any combinations, whether it's within Gateway or Startup or Standard that we might have missed in this video, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. But those are the Jinteki cards right now. Let's get some cards into archives. Let's hope that Nisei prints a face down trap or any trap with to put into archives to poison that, because that gets a lot more interesting. That's largely it. We'll be streaming. Again, we stream always on Thursdays. We're going to be continuing this series of reviews. We have criminal cards coming up next. And that's largely it. Take care. Ciao.